And we are live.
Beautiful. Hey, everybody, we're going to wait a couple minutes here for everyone to start joining. We'll do all the fun introductions and stuff then. In the meantime, if you have questions, you can start to get those ready, because at the very end, we're going to do a Q&A. Your Q's, my A's. Although if I have Q's, then I can always put those out there throughout. Putting a couple final notes here. I do this every time. I tend to over-prepare with these workshops. I've got so much material from which to mine. I want to make sure that we make these next 2 hours meaningful for everyone. And Mr. Mihalik, people will be able to ask questions at the end. Can you curate those for me and then pick the ones that you find to be most applicable and the ones you think I'll have the best answers to?
Absolutely.
Thanks. And where do they leave that? The questions are just on the...
Yeah, you can leave them in the chat box over on the side there. I just suggest saving them until we get to the Q&A session.
Okay.
That's when we'll be paying the most attention to that chat box.
Gotcha. All right, we'll give it 2 more minutes here, and then we will get rolling. Of course, if you miss any of this, if you have to take a bathroom break, you can come on back, or if you need to leave early, if I go too long, then you can come back whenever you like. This thing will be recorded and posted within the next 24 hours. All right, Mihalik, do we have some people who have joined?
We do. We have a lot of people and lots of people saying hi.
Well, howdy. If you hear street noises around me, it's because I'm at my home in Los Angeles, and there's always street things going on outside. Sirens currently. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into this. My name is Joshua Fields Milburn. Welcome to How to Write Better. This is something I've been doing for, 6 years now, I believe, since 2012. And the reason that I started doing How to Write Better, which was initially a 4-week class, and there's a different iteration of that 4-week class that's available and out there right now. But the initial reason that I started doing How to Write Better is I, throughout my 20s, improved my writing significantly, and eventually in my 30s started writing a blog, and I published several books, and people were commenting on my writing, but most of the questions I would get were either about minimalism or they were about how to write, whether it was how to start a blog or how to write a book or how to improve my writing overall, how to write better business emails. I would get variations of essentially the same question, which is, how do I write better? And I kind of got tired of sending similar emails over and over. So I saw there was some sort of pent-up demand there. Where people would get value from my advice. So I started this writing class. And I'll tell you, there's this old adage, there's an old aphorism that says, the teacher learns more than the student. And that was certainly true for me when I first started teaching about writing, because I had written for a long time, but I had never really broken down what my recipe was. You know, it's like if you're a baker and you've learned just the process of baking a cake over many years, you may not even know what the actual recipe is, because you get to some sort of state and you add the sugar and the cacao and the flour and you bake it at this temperature. You know the sequence, you know the ingredients, but you have never taken the time to maybe sit down and analyze it. And the fascinating thing about analyzing my writing process, my recipe for writing, is I learned a whole lot about what was working for me and what wasn't working for me. And in a strange way, it even improved my writing more. So in the last 6 years since teaching people how to write better, my own writing has improved by better understanding my process so I could leave the unnecessary stuff on the cutting room floor. So let me start off today by saying thank you. I'm really honored that you decided to spend a couple hours with me. I want to be really respectful of your time, so I will try to keep this within the allotted 2-hour window. However, if it goes over and you need to leave for any reason, or if you just need to leave in the middle of it for a bathroom break, or you want to go get some popcorn or something, then feel free to stop. You can come back. You can watch the whole video later. In fact, what usually happens is maybe half the people attend the live workshop, sometimes less than that. And then over the course of the next several days, people will come back and watch the material at their own speed. I just want to say before we dive into this is a standalone workshop. The objective of this workshop is not to upload some sort of brain into your head and instantly after 2 hours you are going to be writing better. No, the aim of this workshop is for you to change direction a little bit, to get some insights that will not do a full 180-degree turn and all of a sudden you are an accomplished writer after 2 hours. Of course, writing, like any exercise, does not work that way. But my hope is that we make a small pivot, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, maybe 15 degrees in your writing life, in your writing habits, in your composition, so that a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, that 15-degree pivot puts you in a radically different place than if you were to continue going down this same path that you've been going on. That small change, these incremental changes day by day, make a drastic difference over the course of 1 year, and especially I've noticed 2 years. There's this thing about the changes that we make compounding over the course of the next 2 years. You will be surprised that if you take some of the lessons from today and implement them in your life over the course of the next 2 years, I can assure you, I can guarantee you, you will be in a radically different place with respect to your writing. That said, I can't do the work for you. I find that about half the people who sign up for this workshop or who sign up for my 4-week class, they get immense value. So 50% of the people get value from the class. There are 50% of people who don't get value from the class, and that's really unfortunate. And it saddens me because I hate when people waste their money or their time or their attention. Those are all precious resources, right? Especially your time and your attention. Those are not renewable. And the reason I say only half of people get value from it is because some people come into this with poor expectations. So let me set your expectations right now. If your expectation is over the course of 2 hours, you're going to get some magical tips and tricks that are going to change everything for you, you're mistaken. If your expectation is over the next 2 hours that I'm going to have the secret for how you can write better, you're mistaken. I do have some tips for you. I do have some things that you could call a secret, just things you don't know right now, but I'm happy to share them with you because you've paid money and I'm eager to share the things that have added value to my life. So I would encourage you to be part of the 50% of the people who are actually willing to get value from that, from this workshop. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by willing to get value from it? Well, what I mean is simple, is willing to do some work. I don't have all the answers. I don't pretend to, but over the next 2 hours, I will pretend to. I will ask you to suspend your disbelief for the next 2 hours, and instead of coming here with maybe skepticism or criticism, come in here with an open mind and just treat what I say for the next 2 hours as writing gospel, as if I've been handed down the wisdom of the writing gods. After this workshop, you can clearly dismiss everything I say, and hopefully you'll walk away with at least a few nuggets of information, of advice that will help you in your writing journey. But in order to be part of the 50% of the people who find immense value in this writing workshop, you need to be willing to walk away from this and actually put in some effort, do some writing. And that's when you'll walk away from here with real value. I'll also give you some resources, and at the end of this, we can also talk about my 4-week writing class. It's something you can sign up for if you want. This is, however, this workshop is not a vehicle through which to sell you an additional class or workshop or anything like that. I want you to walk away from this with all the value and much more value than what you paid for, right? You paid $50 to be a part of this. I hope that you walk away with $200 or even more. And then at the end, if you decide you want to dive a little bit deeper into it, then we can talk about signing up for my 4-week writing class as well. But please don't feel compelled to do that. In fact, if you don't have the time or the resources to do that, I totally understand. What you get from this workshop will help move you in the right direction to improve your writing. Okay, so let's dive in. Why do you write? It's a question I had to ask myself when I first started teaching this, when I first started teaching the 4-week class. Why do you write? Because I knew that I wanted to write, but why do I write? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about why you write? By the way, you're welcome to comment and chat amongst yourself. There's a chat box over here. I won't be looking at them right now, but I will go back later and have a look. I'm fascinated by why people think that they write. What are the reasons behind why you write? And at the end, we'll also answer your questions from the chat box as well. So save your questions till the end, and we're going to do a Q&A at the very end of this thing. Well, let me tell you why I write. Why writing is important to me. Why it's been the vehicle, not the only vehicle, but a vehicle through which I choose to communicate and express myself. Well, I just gave you the answer, actually. That's why I write. I write to communicate and to express. Now, these are two different things. And I think good writing marries the two effectively. So let me talk about what the difference is between communication and expression. Communication, the best example I tend to have for something that is strictly communicative is a calculus textbook. Any of you have taken a math class in high school or college, you have experienced some sort of math textbook, likely a calculus textbook. It is completely communicative. It communicates the information that it sets out to deliver, right? And it does so in a relatively effective way. It is pretty boring. It's pretty dry. There's a reason you never see, I was going to say rarely, but let's be honest. There's a reason you never see people on the beach with a calculus textbook. It's not much of a beach read. Well, why is that? Why don't we want to go to the beach and break out the calculus textbook? Because it is strictly communicative. It doesn't express anything. It doesn't make us feel alive. The opposite of communication, or the obverse side of this coin of writing from communication, is expression. The extreme example of expression is a touretic person on a subway. If you hop on the subway here in Los Angeles, you ride around the metro for a while, you inevitably will likely come across a touretic person, a person who is expressing themselves in ways that honestly doesn't even require an audience at all. You get the feeling when you see a person like that they are they're expressing themselves in a very raw sort of way. The opposite way from a calculus textbook. But they would be doing that whether or not the audience was around there. And when I look at these two examples, I try to say, okay, extreme expression doesn't require an audience. It would happen alone. Journaling is one way that we express ourselves, right? It's not writing for an audience usually. I mean, we see a lot of it now with blogging, weblog. A blog is a way for us to journal in public, and so that it does become a bit communicative, although it tends to be mostly expressive if we're just journaling our thoughts, our sort of stream of consciousness onto a page or onto a keyboard. If we're just trying to communicate, though, it's hard to get people to want to take that in, especially because we have more options than ever before. The noise is loud, that's true. I think there's something like 600 TV shows in development this year via different networks. When I walk around Los Angeles, I see these billboards for different music, different movies, different TV shows, different docu-series, and occasionally different books, but also websites and Instagram accounts. There are a lot of distractions out there. We're going to talk about some distractions today, how we can avoid those and maybe replace them with better distractions and also form some habits, right? Before we do that, though, before we talk about the outline of what I hope to talk about today, I wanted to talk to you about some books. If you leave here today with anything of value whatsoever, then I can tell you that you're going to get more than your price of admission just by me recommending these 3 different books for you. And there's a reason for it. Now, I have Shawn Mihalik. Shawn, if you want to say hi, you unmute yourself there. Shawn Mihalik is the How to Write Better adjunct professor. He's also the managing editor at Paleo Magazine, and we've been good friends for a while. He's a very talented novelist. He helps me out with a lot of the How to Write Better stuff, and he's going to collect notes and for this entire workshop today. And he'll send those out to you within 24 hours of it finishing. So anything I talk about today, of course, you can take down your own notes, but if I mention a link to an article or a book or something like that, you don't have to worry about scrambling to write every single thing down, or if you miss something, don't worry about it. You can always go back and listen later, but we'll also send you links to everything that I talk about today. And he'll also be curating the Q&A questions toward the end so that we can talk about those at the end. So there are 3 books I want to recommend to you today to help you improve your writing. And the reason I say you're going to get a lot of value from these is you don't have to waste your time with a bunch of other books. I mean, there are plenty of decent books about writing out there. I used to say I've read over 100 books about writing. That statement wasn't entirely true. I've started reading at least 100 books about writing. I'm pretty good about getting rid of a book if the first 8 or 15 pages don't really draw me in. So I've read quite a few books about writing, about composition, about editing, about fiction writing, about storytelling, about grammar, about just books on writing in general. And the 3 books I want to talk about today, the first one is a book called Grammatically Correct. If you buy one book about writing, that's the book I think you should buy. It's by a woman named Anne Stillman. And at first, the book drove me a little crazy because she wasn't completely prescriptive. And I'm a person who likes everything black and white, but of course, the English language is not completely black and white. It is ever evolving, right? I mean, if you go back to Shakespearean English, that's supposedly modern English, but it looks nothing like the works of our favorite writers today, whether that's Seth Godin or Laurie Moore or Mary Carr. Their writing looks radically different from Shakespeare's, both of which you could argue are good. That's because not everything is binary. There are good rules to grammar that are applicable to this moment in time. And Anne Stillman, in her book Grammatically Correct, helps you sort of suss out some of those rules that will help you out a bit. But the reason it drove me crazy as a book is because she would acknowledge that there are ways that grammar changes. And this might be a rule, but it's not a steadfast rule. And here are ways to maybe manipulate that rule. So she goes deep in grammar. The title of the book is Grammatically Correct. But she also shows you how to adequately break the rules. And so with my writing students in my 4-week class, it's the first book I require people to read, because I think it's instantly going to help you better understand some of the rules and the structures of improving your writing. The second book I'm going to recommend is a modern usage dictionary. It's by Brian Gardner. Mihalik, I think you're probably going to tell me this isn't the most recent version. I think you have a newer version.
I have the most recent version right here.
Yes, so we'll send you a link to this. Mine, I guess, is a few years old. Hopefully it's not so out of date I don't get any value from it. Now, this is a modern usage dictionary, but it's not a dictionary in the sense of the word that you're used to, right? A modern usage dictionary basically goes through and gives you certain rules. It talks about, here, I just flipped to any page. It talks about noun-pronoun disagreement. It talks about different uses of words. Mihalik, how do you use this book currently?
I use it mostly as an editor more than a writer. I use it when I'm working with other writers, just to, if any word pops up as I'm reading their work that I'm curious whether that is the correct or even the best way to use it. But more often than not, what happens is I do that, and then I find myself just going down a rabbit hole for a good hour that has nothing to do with what I was working on, because I just nerd out about everything that's in there.
Yeah, if you're fascinated by language, if you're fascinated by writing, or if you just want to get better at constructing your sentences, it, for me, has been a great book. And in fact, we're going to talk about the difference between composition and editing in a moment. The first book I talked about with Grammatically Correct is a book that aids composition really well. And then Gardner's Modern American Usage Dictionary is a book that aids editing really well. We're going to talk about the two and why the two are two different legs of a four-legged table. The third and final book I'm going to recommend today, there are other books I recommend in my longer class, but this is a book that's hard to find. We'll send you a link to try to get it used. Hopefully, you can. Mine's full of all kinds of notes in it. A good friend of mine, Shawn Mihalik, the other Shawn, who's also our podcast producer and one of the best editors I know, recommended this to me years ago. I think it was in my late 20s. And I've gotten more value from this book than any other book when it comes to being a technician, to making my writing more beautiful. It's called Writing with Clarity and Style by Robert A. Harris, and it is no longer in print. And it's becoming harder and harder to find. You don't have to get it. It's not a book that I would require of anyone. In fact, I would recommend those first two books first, getting through those before investing in a book like this. Because if you find it, it's probably going to cost you a couple $100 because it's out of print. And so I don't say go there right away, but once you have figured out composition and editing and you really want to refine your writing, make it more beautiful, this book breaks down things like asyndeton versus polysyndeton. And you're like, what the hell is that? Well, that's just writing with commas versus conjunctions. I'm not a grammarian. I'm certainly not a lexicographer. So I'm less worried about grammar than most people might think. That's why I provide these resources so that you have them and you can go back and reference them. Also one other thing I'll recommend briefly is the Chicago Manual of Style online writing guide, their website. I mean, you can buy the physical book as well, but the reason I like the online website, Chicago Manual of Style, is, well, it's searchable. It's a searchable database. If you have a question about something, you're like, should I say as or because in this sentence? Then there's a quick resource. You can sort of figure things out with the Chicago Manual of Style. So I highly recommend starting with those resources and spending a little bit of time starting with Ann Stillman's book, Grammatically Correct. I noticed I don't have my copy of that with me today. I lent it out, which means I probably need to buy a new one because whenever I lend books out, they tend to just disappear into the ether. And so I buy a lot of books and I don't end up keeping, because that to me is the best thing about a physical book is I can hand it to you. I'm a big fan of ebooks personally, and also audiobooks. Those are harder to just say, here's this book, have this. And so there's some books, as a matter of fact, I'll buy by the case sometimes. And we can talk, if you have questions about some of those, we can talk about those later.
If I can chime in real quick,
Sure.
Writing with Clarity and Style is back in print as of the end of last year. and is on Amazon new for about $40 with Prime shipping.
That's great. I'm gonna have to buy several copies then, because inevitably I had some students who are like, I can't find this for $500 or whatever, because what would happen is a lot of my students would buy it and then they would use it and they'd resell it once they were done with it, which is also a good thing. This book was a bit of a asset for a while because it was so limited. It's an asset in a different way now. That's good news. Thank you, Mihalik. Appreciate that. All right, let's dive into types of writing. So many of you are taking this class, this workshop rather, because you want to write your first book, or maybe you want to start a blog, or maybe you want to improve your blog writing, or maybe you just want to improve your emails at work or to your friends and family. Or I even had one person said, I just want to write better text messages. And that might be you. Maybe you just want to improve your text messages. Well, here's the good news. No matter what you want to do, whether it's write the great American novel or improve your text messages or something in between, the rising tide lifts all boats. So if you learn how to improve your writing in one area, it's going to help writing in other areas as well. They are all interconnected. And so I think that there are 6 types of writing. So we get down to, we want our writing to be communicative, we want our writing to be expressive, and then there are 6 different ways through which we communicate and express. So 6 types of writing these are this is the lens through which I look at different types of writing. Now you might say, well, here's a 7th type, and I think that's great. And there are of course subtypes to each of these types as well, but let's just go through these really quickly. And sort of in ascending or descending order of communication. So the most communicative writing, it tends to be business writing, or maybe even academic writing, you could call that. You could even call that friendly writing. If you're sending a text message, or you're just sending emails to a friend. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to call it business writing. And it's the most communicative writing. If you're writing a memo, a communique for work via email that's going to go out to a lot of people, it's going to need to communicate as much as you want it to communicate, not more, but in a relatively short period of time. In fact, one of the reasons that I got started and built up my confidence in being able to write is people at work started coming up to me and saying things like, man, I really enjoy the emails you've been writing at work. They're kind of funny, but they communicate exactly what they need to communicate. Can you show me how you write those emails? What do you do? And in a weird way, the whole process I'm going to walk you through today applied to the emails the same way that applied to book writing. And so you have business writing. That could be text messages. It could be emails. It could be writing little guides or pamphlets or marketing materials. You want to communicate what you're trying to communicate effectively to the audience that you're trying to communicate to, right? So that's the most communicative. And then slightly less communicative is the second type of writing. It's prescriptive nonfiction. You may call this self-help even. We see a lot of blogs that are out there today that is, and most of them do a fairly poor job. I mean, that's just that's going to be the mathematics behind it, though, right? 50,000 new blogs are started every day, and just by the nature of odds, a lot of it's going to be bad, and that's okay. But it's not okay to continue to be bad if we know that bad, our writing is bad. We want to improve on that writing, right? And so some of the bad stuff that we see out there, the clickbaity kind of things, the top 10 lists, the how-to guides, as if I'm going to show someone, and it'd be like if I wrote a blog post called How to Write Better. No, I mean, it takes me, I think my 4-week class has 21 videos, and it's 4 weeks long to show people how to write better. A lot of things that are how-to aren't actual how-tos. They're articles that are written in a way that is salacious enough to aggregate enough eyeballs onto their content so that they can sell you something. And that's just not a good thing. I mean, ultimately, the best self-help, if we can reclaim that word for a moment, allows people to be introspective, right? I think about some of my favorite bloggers online, someone like Seth Godin or Cal Newport. Shawn, if you could put links to both of those in these notes, that'd be great. I think of their writing as helpful, as problem solving, right? Prescriptive nonfiction, another way to say that is writing that solves people's problems. And they tend to avoid anything that is salacious. They tend to avoid anything that is SEO driven, search engine optimization driven. They tend to avoid the short-term game because they're much more interested in what Seth Godin calls the long tail. Creating something that is meaningful, that will last for many days, weeks, months, and years to come, as opposed to writing something that catches fire really quick, but then goes away very quickly. I've been writing online for, man, nearly a decade now. I think it's been 8 years online. And I can proudly say that I've never had anything that's gone viral. I've never had a viral success with respect to anything that I've written. But I've had a lot of things that have added a lot of value and have been shared amongst people. And so I'm much more concerned with going deep than I am going wide. Wide and as small as viable audience. If you reach 100 people but go really deep with those 100 people, I mean, think about this for a moment. Do you have 100 Facebook friends? If so, how do you solve some problems for them? And then eventually that spreads, and that people tend to share that. I mean, we'll get into my backstory in a moment, but I can think the first month I started blogging, Ryan and I started blogging, 52 people visited our website. And that was amazing to me at the time, because it meant that what I was writing was actually starting to resonate with people. Because prior to that, everything I had written had basically been seen by publishers and agents, and I'd just gotten rejection letters back. And now finally someone was saying yes. And I was writing for those 52 people, and 52 in time becomes 500, because as you write and you go deeper, some people tend to share that. And if you're helping them solve their problems, it's a basic human instinct is to add value to other people's lives, right? And so if I find something I really find value in, the first thing I'll do is I'll share it, whether that's on Facebook with my friends or on Twitter, or send a text message to a friend. Hey, I really think you're going to get value from this article I just read, this blog post, this essay, this newspaper article, whatever it might be. I got value from this, and because I know you, I think you'll get value from it too. I often say that I think the best social media button on our website is the email a friend button, because that's who you really trust, are the people you're closest with, right? I mean, yeah, you might see something from someone you follow on Twitter and say, oh, that's neat. That sounds interesting. I'll click on that. But you're much more likely to get value from something because someone curated it for you and they sent it over to you. And so the second kind of writing, prescriptive nonfiction, is quite often what I do on our blog, or with our blog, at least one of our books, Minimalism, Live a Meaningful Life. It's prescriptive self-help. It's more how-to kind of stuff, and also what to. But that moves us on to the next type of writing, and I would call it journalistic writing. And this is when we have the objective or seemingly objective observer who is reporting on a type of, on a series of events. And so there's one that stands out to me recently. There's a really well-known hip-hop artist that died really young. His name was XXXTentacion. And there was an intern for the new Miami New Herald. Her name was Tarpley Hitt. And Shawn, if we could find a link to this article she wrote, it was journalism done really well, and it shows you what an intern can do if they're willing to dive deep and into their research and create something meaningful. So it it combines the elements of communication from business writing or prescriptive nonfiction, but also starts to really inject more of the expressiveness via the lens of the people that she is interviewing. And so it was a great journalistic piece. And the reason that one was so inspiring to me is to see an intern who is clearly doing the work of someone. I mean, hopefully the New York Times snatches her up and has her reporting on other things that are important in our daily lives, because we see what she's capable of. She's capable of diving deep, communicating information in a non-biased way, unbiased way, but also injecting the points of view, multiple points of view that bring expression, bring life and feeling to the writing. The fourth type of writing is narrative nonfiction. So we've gone through business writing, prescriptive nonfiction, journalistic writing, and then we've got narrative nonfiction. Narrative nonfiction would be like a memoir. I wrote a book called Everything That Remains back in, came out in 2014. And it's my favorite thing that I've ever written still. And now we're talking a whole lot more expression. It's really balancing. To me, narrative nonfiction is the thing that it's probably slightly more expressive, but it balances expression and communication almost evenly. Maybe it's 60% expression and 40% communication, but it blends the two really well. And a book I'm going to recommend if you're interested in doing narrative nonfiction, memoir, or immersive essays would be another way to maybe look at it. Immersive essays. There's a great book by, what is his name? I'm sure I have it on my shelf over here. Let me think of some other books if I can't think of it right now. Well, here's one for you. I mean, the classic example that I always like is David Foster Wallace wrote an essay called A Ticket to the Fair. We'll put a link to that in the follow-up email as well. I'd like if you could do that. And A Ticket to the Fair is basically full-on immersion into something that is going on in a relatively banal scenario that is turned into something beautiful. But the book I'm going to recommend is not that. It's called The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr. Now, Mary Karr is my favorite memoirist. She has 3 great memoirs, one called The Liars Club, one called Cherry, and one called Lit. She's also a poet, and her writing is truly beautiful. But she breaks down the art of the memoir. I'll give you just an example here of what she has in the book. I can find it here. Where she talks about on information, facts, and data. So one of the things that I find when I'm writing, especially trying to blend communication and expression, is I try to figure out what's interesting and what is interesting to other people. What do I mean by that? Well, some things are really interesting to me, but conveying that information may not be interesting to anybody else. If you go to the grocery store and you start shopping for oranges, that from some reason might be really interesting to you. But if you can't convey that in a way that it makes sense for the reader to want to continue to read, it doesn't create some sort of narrative urgency, which we will definitely talk about later in this workshop. In fact, let me write that down because I think it's important to cover narrative urgency. If you're writing something just about your banal, vapid trip to the grocery store, it doesn't matter. But if there's a lesson to be learned there, and the reason I bring up oranges, a few years ago, Ryan and I wrote an essay while we were on tour called There Will Be Bruises. And it was about a trip to the store of us buying these oranges and then keeping them in our back seat. But there was something more to that experience than just the buying of oranges. There was a life lesson embedded in that. And ultimately, that's what narrative nonfiction is. It is a life lesson communicated in an expressive way. The fifth type of writing is fictive writing, or fiction, right? I think some of my favorite fiction writers, someone like Dennis Johnson, who wrote this book called Jesus' Son, which hopefully we'll get to read an excerpt from it a little bit later when we talk about senses. Really beautiful writing, but fictive writing or fiction writing is storytelling. It is ultimate, well, not ultimate expression, because there's one more type of writing here in a moment. But it is expressive. It is a mining of the interior life, the interior landscape of what it means to be a human being. Mihalik, have you read, Dennis Johnson died recently. Have you read his new short story collection? I just started it this morning.
No, I read a few stories from it that appeared in the New Yorker over the last few years, but I haven't read the whole collection.
There's something about the writing from this new book that is, it's almost as if someone else wrote it. It's still beautiful, but there's something like aggressively, he's trying not to be beautiful almost. There's a beauty in its lack of, maybe it's aggressively utilitarian, at least the first story I've read so far, and I'm not even halfway through the first story. But there's a particular kind of beauty, and what he does really well in his fiction is he really brings the senses to the foreground, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. And then fifth, last but not least, the sixth type of writing. Fifth was fiction. Sixth is poetry. I'm not extremely well versed in poetry, and there are blurred lines with all of these. That is also journalistic, or you might write, a blog post, which is sort of self-help, but it's also steeped in the elements of memoir. You might write some fiction that is flash fiction. There's a type of fiction called flash fiction, which is like extremely short stories, aggressively short stories, but they can contain the elements of poetry. And so the sixth type, poetry, is like extreme expression. It may communicate something, but it really rides the expressiveness of the author, and thus it can communicate different things to different readers. Right? You might read a poem and get one thing. They're obviously trying to communicate this to me. Another way to think of poetry is think of songs. In particular, a singer-songwriter kind of songs. That's just poetry. A lot of it's written in the second person, you. But it is poetry. It's simply a type of poetry. A lot of it happens to rhyme, but it is expression. And you might get something from a song. You walk away from that song feeling one thing. I'm going to walk away feeling something completely different. Does that mean you're wrong and I'm wrong? No. Both of us might be right. Both of us probably are right, because that's what expression is meant to do. It's meant to make us feel something. Now, with the calculus textbook, going back to the business writing or the academic writing, if there's a math problem presented on page 333, and I walk away with one answer and you walk away with a different answer, then one of us probably is wrong. Or maybe both of us are even wrong, right? Because the communicative writing is meant to convey a certain thing. The expressive writing is meant to make you feel something. Today we're going to talk about writing as a four-legged table. In the 4-week writing class that I teach, it's broken into 4 weeks for a reason. The same way, like I'm sitting at this desk right here. It's a type of table, and this desk has 4 legs on it. If I remove one of the legs, well, then all of a sudden my computer's probably going to fall into my lap, and we're going to be in for a world of hurt. So you need all 4 legs of the table. They're all 4 equally important. If I make one of these legs shorter, then I'm going to have a lopsided table and things are going to fall off. If I remove one leg altogether, it ceases to even be a table. It's just a pile of junk. And too often, when we start diving into writing, we think of one of the legs, and it's actually the second leg, composition. But we're going to pause on that for a moment. We'll get to the composition process. When we think of writing, we actually think of the act of composing. That's writing. And while that may look like writing, it's only one element. It's one of the four legs on the table. So there are four legs to any type of writing. Even bad writing is going to have these four legs. It may just have one of them is shorter than the other, or one of them is too long, right? The first leg is habit, establishing a writing habit. And that's where we're going to start in a moment with these four legs. And I spend the first week of my 4-week writing class going through building the writing habit. I think it's the most important leg out of all of these, because without it, none of the other legs can even be created, really, or at least not created in an effective way. The second leg is composition. That's what we think of when we think of just regular writing. It's getting the words onto the page. The third leg that we're going to talk about to this writing table is editing. And it is the most overlooked of the legs, but in many ways, the most evident leg. The leg that we see the most, but we don't know that we see. In fact, when we have really good writing, you don't even notice how well edited it is, because it is so well edited. And the fourth leg, and the one that we as writers are often allergic to this leg for some reason, as though it's covered in poison ivy. If I can mix my metaphors here. Don't do that in your writing, by the way. I'll only do that extemporaneously. The fourth leg to this writing table that is covered in poison ivy, this particular leg, because we're all allergic to it as writers, is publishing. It's getting our work out into the world, because if you're writing, you want other people to read it. Otherwise, you're just journaling, and that can be great, but that's not communicative in a way. We want our writing to be both communicative and expressive, because if you're just journaling for yourself, it's by definition not communicative, because you're not communicating to anyone. Maybe you're communicating to your future self or something, but even then, that's an audience, right? And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to call it publishing, or what I call neopub, the new ways of publishing. We're really fortunate, you and I, to live in a time that we live in, because there are so many options to get our writing in front of the world and to build an audience, to establish a readership, and most importantly, to add value to other people's lives. And so we're going to talk about those four things: writing habit, composition, editing, and publishing today. And those actually make up the 4 weeks of my writing class as well. But I'm going to give you the highlights, the things that are most important, so you can walk away from this workshop today and know where you're going to go to improve your writing. So let's start with writing habit. And I think the best way to start with writing habit is to talk a little bit about my backstory. So a lot of you started this workshop knowing various bits about my past. So for those of you who are uninformed, I'll give you the 10,000-foot view. I was born in 1981 in Dayton, Ohio, and I grew up relatively poor. I was on food stamps and government assistance, and I didn't read very much growing up as a kid. Reading was not something that was very important to me. And I bring that up because many people think in order to be a writer, you have to have loved books since you came out of the womb. You came out of the womb with a quill in hand, and you were ready to start writing, and you had a book in the other hand, and you were reading rigorously throughout your youth. But that's not always the case. Because I grew up poor, I thought the reason we were discontented is we didn't have any money. And so when I turned 18, I went out and I got a corporate sales job, and I spent the next dozen years climbing the corporate ladder. By my late 20s, I was ostensibly successful at all the trinkets of success, but I didn't feel like I was creatively successful. I didn't feel fulfilled because I didn't feel like I was living up to what my values were. In fact, I didn't even know what my values were. I was overweight. At one point, I weighed 80 pounds more than I weigh now. My relationships were in shambles. My marriage ended in my late 20s, and my mother died that same month. And I started looking around and questioning what had become my life's focus. And I realized that I was really focused on a lot of things people told me, society told me, that I should be focused on. Maybe they didn't directly tell me. No one came to me and said, you should be focused on working 80 hours a week. You should want to make a lot of money. Although I did work 80 hours a week, and I did make really good money. I spent even better money, so I had heaps of debt because my life was filled with a lot of discontent. I tried to fill the void with consumer purchases and accumulating more stuff, as opposed to figuring out what my values were and consuming less and creating more. In fact, that's really going to be the directive of building up a good writing habit. It's about consuming less, removing the distractions, and creating more. Now, for me, reading became an important part of my life during those sort of tumultuous years. And I can actually be thankful for that void that I felt, because one of the ways that I filled that void was through just unabashed consumption. I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the ways that I consumed that was actually meaningful is I found literature. And there was this beautiful exchange of consciousness that I found in books that I didn't find in any other medium. Not movies, not TV shows. I mean, I think those could be great expressive pieces of art. And we can certainly get something from movies that we can't from books, and vice versa. Or even music. I mean, I think music has a beautiful exchange of consciousness, and it's probably the closest thing to just the written word. It's the closest thing to reading a beautiful masterpiece of fiction. But there's something about writing, this exchange of consciousness that I was getting starting in my early 20s, around age 21, where I started reading books, and any free moment I had, a lunch break or after work, I would go to the bookstore and I would just sit there and I would get lost in another world. And it's what drew me to writing right away, is I knew I wanted to be part of that exchange of consciousness. I knew that I wanted to create what I was getting. And in a way, I didn't have the words to say this at the time, but I wanted to add that same value I was getting from these authors. I wanted to create that same value for other people. Because ultimately, I think the most fulfilling thing that we can do is contribute beyond ourselves. And finding a meaningful way to do that for me was via writing. There are other ways I do it now, but I can tell you that, I mean, whether it's doing YouTube videos or even teaching this workshop, or Ryan and I do a podcast every week, or social media or whatever, there are other ways to add value to people's lives. And I certainly enjoy those, but my true passion is writing. The thing that makes me feel most alive in terms of creativity is writing. And that doesn't mean it's always exciting. In fact, let's table that for a moment. That word exciting. Because I'm going to write it down here. It's not always going to be exciting, and that's actually okay. But anyway, I discovered this exchange of consciousness. I knew I wanted to be a part of it, and for the longest time, I was an aspiring writer. I suspect many of you are aspiring writers. I spent most of my 20s aspiring really hard. That's all I did. There was aspiration everywhere, but the pages were still blank. And well, the reason for that is, well, it has to do with that idea of excitement that I just wrote down. I would start writing something. I'd get really excited about an idea. I'd write it down. Short story idea, an idea for a novel. I get really excited, and I'd start writing on it. I'd work on it, and I'd write a page, maybe 2 pages, or maybe 8 pages of writing. There was one time, the second novel I ever started working on was a novel that was called Just Past Central. And I got 70 pages in. This is my mid-20s. 70 pages in, and it was going nowhere. Partially because the main character dies in the first sentence. So it was really hard for me to figure that out beyond, I'm surprised I got 70 pages. But the reason I got stuck at 70 pages is there was a bit of a road bump there. I was no longer excited. I realized, like, this is hard work. I'm not excited about this idea anymore. And so I set it aside and I'd work on the next thing. Oh, there's a short story idea. And I work on that for a week or 2 weeks or 6 months, like I did those first 70 pages. And then eventually I'd move on to the next thing because I'd lose the excitement of that idea. But that's not real passion. The reason I'm passionate about writing today is because I no longer mistake it for excitement. The Latin root, I just had, what was his name? TK Coleman, a friend of mine, TK Coleman, on the podcast recently. We were talking about passion. Check out the podcast episode. It's called Direction. I think you'll find a lot of value in it. But we were talking about the Latin root of the word passion means to suffer. And boy, I wish I would have known that when I was 25, because I thought the Latin root of passion meant excitement, or at least I just thought the word passion meant excitement. I thought that in order for me to be passionate about an idea, I must be 100% excited about it 100% of the time. Well, what a poor expectation. Because if you have one snag, one snafu, then all of a sudden I must not be passionate about this. That type of excitement is ephemeral. It doesn't last. But what does last is passion. Because real passion comes from drudging through the drudgery. If I can give you advice, those are the 4 words. If I describe developing a writing habit, it's drudging through the drudgery. I'm going to give you 3 more words, the 3 most profound words that ever affected me in my late 20s in a moment. But drudge through the drudgery was something I realized that I had to do if I ever wanted to feel passionate about something, because the real passion doesn't come from the excitement. It comes from what Seth Godin might call the dip. There's this moment in creativity where nothing is working and, oh my God, I throw my hands up, this is not going to work, I'm going to walk away from this. And all of a sudden it starts to click. You figure out that the real passion, the real meaningful work, the real creativity comes after the drudgery, after that dip. All the reward, all the payoff is so much better than this level of excitement. The payoff is up here. It's truly outstanding. The excitement feels great in the moment, but the payoff is, wow, I created that thing, that blog post, that book, that email that I'm really proud of. An email I'm really proud of. Yeah. I remember in the corporate world, I would write emails, and when I hit send, I felt elated because I knew it wasn't perfect. Don't mistake what I'm saying for perfection. Rather, it was the best I could do given the resources I had. The resources might be the knowledge, the wisdom that I've acquired over the years, or the lack thereof, right? I mean, I don't have all the knowledge of a David Foster Wallace or of a Mary Carr, but I have the knowledge that I have at this moment. That's one resource that I have. Another resource is the time that I have. If you have to get a business email done by the end of the day today, then that's the resource you have. You don't have all week to work on that. So it's not going to be perfect. It needs to be ideal given those constraints. And sometimes the good news here is those constraints actually aid our creativity. I call them creative constraints. These sort of creative limitations. We can build up these self-imposed limitations instead of having expectations of perfection or excitement or raw passion all the time. Building these limitations that allow us to be more creative within them. And so sometimes time can be a limitation. Sometimes word count can be a limitation. I think back to Hemingway's famous 6-word short story. There was a short story contest, and Hemingway's short story in 6 words was baby shoes for sale, never worn. And there's a whole world in those 6 words. There's a whole story that you can imagine. I mean, talk about expressiveness. I mean, it communicates a few things, but it's as expressive as any poem that I've read. And that's because you might walk away with that with a totally different interpretation from how I will walk away from it. In fact, some of the best writing has to do not with what is written, but with what isn't written. What happens to the right of the frame, so to speak. Going back to David Foster Wallace, his book Infinite Jest is one of my favorite books. Although it's not my favorite David Foster Wallace book even, but it's one of my favorite books because it's one of the books in my mid-20s. I was 26 when I first picked that book up and started reading it. And it took about 6 months to get through. And it made me realize something, that great writing can require a lot of a reader as long as there is a great payoff. Sometimes that payoff happens over here. How many fingers am I holding up right now? I don't know, but if I have been talking about, I mean, you don't know, I know exactly how many fingers I'm holding up. It's 2. But if we had been talking about something that led you to believe, maybe I'm holding up 2 fingers, or maybe it's 3, something happens to the right of the frame. And Infinite Jest did this perfectly. It's 1,100 pages of very dense writing, but every line is beautiful. Every line is meaningful in that book, and that's what makes it so impressive. It's just gorgeously written, but also a lot of what happens over here. And you have to, I mean, talk about the ultimate expression. You have to, it's not like a detective novel where it sums everything up, ties it up with a neat little bow. A lot of it has to do with irresolvability or resolving itself outside of the normal narrative. And that's human life, isn't it? Not everything by the end of this life will be resolved. Talking about what it means to be alive. I mean, reading a book like that, you really understand the internal life. What's the interior life of what's going on inside us as humans, is what's going on with us and with addiction and creativity. And I think ultimately writing asks more questions than it answers. Good writing, at least. In fact, when I write online, some of these relatively short blog posts, it's meant for the reader to walk away from that maybe asking more questions of themselves than me giving you the 7 answers to live a more meaningful life. Here are the 7 ways. If you just do these steps, then all of a sudden everything is fixed. Now those things will get more clicks. They'll go wide, but they won't go deep. And as a writer, yes, I want to write for an audience. I want to add value to more people's lives, but not sacrificing going deep for those people, right? So in my 20s, I started finding that as I pushed through the work, as I drudged through the drudgery, I was able to actually sit down and create something that was meaningful. Now that drudgery meant, I remember when I first started writing seriously, I wanted to put my head through the wall 50% of the time. I mean, but the other 50% is like the best feeling in the world. It's like that and sex, and that's it. Like getting through the drudgery was just in creating something that you're like manically impressed with. It requires that work of, oh my God, this is never going to work, or oh, this is stupid, or I can't believe I write a line that was so bad. And in fact, I'm going to write that down here. I want to talk to you about Anne Lamont's shitty first draft in a moment. But anyway, it required that 50% of the time I wanted to put my head through that wall right there, right? But over time, something pretty cool happened. As I wrote more and more, as I established a writing habit, 50% turned into 40% of the time wanting to put my head through the wall, which meant like 80% of the time it was, well, actually that's not true. Let me backtrack a little bit. If I'm being completely honest with you, 80% of the time, when I first started writing, I wanted to put my head through a wall. It was definitely not half the time it felt good. It was only about 20% of the time. And I'm thinking about now even, it's not great all the time either. So when it started out, it was 80-20. And if 80% of the time I put my head through the wall, the other 20% of the time was like breakthrough, oh my God, manic, this is beautiful, wow. In fact, I even go back and look at some of the writing. There's a few bits of writing from Just Past Central, the novel I talked about, that made it into my actual first and only novel that I've published so far, a book called As the Decade Fades. And so some of that writing is from when I was 24, 25 years old. And it's some of the most gorgeous writing I've ever written. And in fact, I go back and look at it and say, who wrote that? How could I have possibly written that? Like, it's so good. And it's so different from what I would write now. But I'm a different person now too. And so you're also sort of, as you're writing, you're capturing this moment, this moment in time, so that you're almost framing it in a way. And I look back at that now. I look back at that writing and I say, wow, like, I find it to be really meaningful, but I can't even believe I did it. But that's what came. That was that 20% of the time where I didn't want to put my head through the wall, where I'm like, oh my God, this is actually working. But it took the 80%. It took the heap of junk to get to that thing that was that fresh breath, that walking away from your keyboard and saying, yeah, that's it. That's why I do this. And so eventually 80% turned into 70% of me wanting to put my head through the wall 70% of the time, and being elated 30% of the time. And then a few years later, it was 60% of the time. More times than not, it was still difficult, but there were more wins than there were before. And even today, I think it's probably 50-50. There are days where it's, oh my God, what am I doing? Oh, I can't believe I wrote a stupid line like that. That is a shitty first draft for sure. And there are other days where it's like, wow, this is why I do what I do. And I'm grateful that I get to be a writer, right? Now, being a writer is not what's important to me, though. Writing is what is important to me. I call it turning a noun into a verb. In fact, it's one of the reasons that I didn't write for a really long time is I was scared to call myself a writer. Does that resonate with anyone? Anyone else here scared to admit that they want to write? Anyone else scared to go to their friends and family and tell them that I want to be a writer? That's how I was. I hid it for a long time. Because, well, it's the first thing we ask someone. What do you do? We like to put ourselves in these little boxes. If I say I'm a writer, then of course I'm going to start getting the accusatory questions immediately. Oh, you're a writer? Who's your publisher? Have you written anything that I would have read? How many books have you written? And so I avoided for the longest time saying I'm a writer because I was scared of it. But now I'm not scared to say it. I mean, I've had some success as a writer, so that makes it easier. But I could care less about being a writer. What I'm much more concerned with is the act of writing. And so when I say turning a noun into a verb, instead of saying I'm a writer, I'll say I'm passionate about writing. Because isn't that more important anyway? Sure, we're all writers now. You wrote a text message this morning, didn't you? You wrote an email yesterday, right? You're a writer. Great. Congratulations. What does that mean? What's more important to me is I'm passionate about writing. The actual act of composition and editing, that's what I'm passionate about. Getting those words onto the page and then fashioning them into something meaningful. That's what I'm passionate about. That's the verb, writing. It's much more interesting to me than writer. Writer has all this baggage with it. Writing is pure. In my late 20s, I met with the novelist, Donald Ray Pollock. He's from Chillicothe, Ohio. It's an old factory town, which is not too far from Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up. We met at this Thai restaurant in Chillicothe. I sent him an email, and somehow he agreed to have a meal with me. And he's a man's man. Worked in a factory for close to 30 years until he was 55, and he decided it's one of the most inspirational stories that I've ever come across, because I realized if he could do it, I could do it. He, at age 55, walked away from the factory he'd been working in for a long time. It was an old Mead paper mill in Chillicothe. He left there and set up a desk in his attic, and his wife agreed for, I think it was 5 years or a couple of years, whatever it was, that would be his main focus, instead of him going to work every day. He saved up just enough money to live very, very humbly. And he had to teach a writing class a couple days a week as well in order to make it work. But he was just going to be a writer full time, give this a shot. And if it didn't work out, then he would find out what the next thing was. He did this at age 55. And he wrote a beautiful short story collection, downtrodden short story collection called Knock 'em Stiff, which takes place in a town right outside of Chillicothe. It's a ghost town now called Knock 'em Stiff, Ohio, which, what a great name for a town. He has a novel called The Devil All the Time. And both of those books were just so impressive to me, that this new writer who's in his late 50s was able to create something so beautiful. I mean, that if that is his opus at the end of his life, just those two books. He's written a subsequent book since then, which I've not read yet, but it is on my short list at this point. I dive too deep into a lot of books, and so I will get to it. But man, the thing about Donald Ray Pollock is, if that was his opus, he did what he was passionate about, and that wasn't being a writer. It was writing. He created something beautiful, something meaningful, something expressive that a lot of us aspire to do, but we don't actually do the work. I asked him, well, how did you do it? Like, once you walked away from it, like, what's the biggest thing that you could tell me about that process? I was trying to understand his recipe. He told me 4 words. 4 words that changed the way that I think about writing. Sit in the chair. Now, what do you mean by that? Sit in the chair. That's what I'm doing right now. Am I accomplishing anything by it? No, it's a metaphor. I mean, yeah, I'm accomplishing something now. We're talking, right? But no, sit in the chair was a metaphor. He expanded on it when we talked. He said, you want to be distraction free. He didn't say it that way. He said, none of the phones or texts or tweets or any of that other stuff. No Wi-Fi. You need to sit in the chair. What he meant was do the work. Push past what Stephen Pressfield would call the resistance. He has a good book. We'll send you a link to that as well, called The War of Art. Not the art of war, but the war of art. And that really has to do with pushing past the resistance. And I think one of the reasons we resist now is it's easier than ever to resist, right? We have so many distractions. We have the internet. We have television. We have social media. We have magazines. We have apps. We have music. We have work. We have children. We have a lot of things that are easy for us to let get in the way. And for me, when I was first trying to write, when I was still aspiring to write, one of the reasons I didn't write very much is I had set up all of these rules to sit down and write. Rule number 1 is I had to have the appropriate beverage right in front of me. I had to have my glass of water, and then I had to have a cup of coffee, right? And then, oh yeah, the laundry needs to be done. I need to have just the right amount of lighting. The thermostat needs to be set to the appropriate temperature. I need to have the right background music on. candles need to be flickering. Basically, I'd set up these 15 different rules. Say, once I do all these, then I will start writing. And I'd get through 14 of them. But of course, there'd always be one more, right? There's always one more rule. There's always one distraction, one roadblock that would stop me from sitting down and writing. My list of rules has been attenuated dramatically since then. I have one rule now, and it's wake up. I like to write in the morning. Now, that might not be the appropriate time for you for a litany of reasons. Maybe you are not an early riser like I am. I really like the mornings. If I can get up at 3:30 in the morning, some mornings I will. Not because of an alarm, but because of that's the time where I feel most creative. It's sort of this bridge between the dream world and the real world. For some people, they like to write late at night. Sometimes it's people writing on their lunch break. I don't care when you do it. What's important is that you sit in the chair and actually do it. I no longer worry about word count or page count. That might be something that helps you. And if so, great. I don't say take away from that. But for me, the only count that matters is how long I sit in the chair distraction-free. If you walk away from this entire workshop today with one bit of action to take, and that bit of action is simple. It's sit in the chair, those 4 words. If you sit in the chair for at least 1 hour a day, 1 hour a day, for the next month, for the next 30 days, you do it all of July. Actually, it's 31 days in July. That's an extra hour you get there. Bonus hour. If you do that 1 hour a day, minimum 1 hour a day, for the next 30 days, I can guarantee you your writing will have improved so dramatically over the next 30 days that you're going to look back on what you first did and say, wow, I can't believe that I've improved that much in 1 month. Now think about if you did that every day for 2 years, what would happen? You'd be a different person. You'd be a writer. But of course, you wouldn't care about the writing anymore because you'd be passionate about writing. Now, sitting in the chair distraction-free means turn the internet off. Get your phone away from you. I like to remove the distractions. There's no pictures or paintings or anything on my wall. I like to have a blank desk when I write. And if you're going to distract yourself in other parts of the day, the best distraction for me are books. Have books that you aspire to write like. This is a book by Derek Sivers, who has become a friend of mine. We had him on the podcast in New Zealand. We did a conversation with him. But this book, Anything You Want, is an amazing book because of its concision. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about editing in a moment. But read books. Writers improve their writing by writing. That's most important. They also improve their writing by reading. I tend to walk around with a highlighter. My highlighter's over there on the kitchen table because I was reading Dennis Johnson's new book this morning. And I just highlight stuff. If I'm doing it on my Kindle or my Kindle app, I highlight stuff there. I'll often repeat sentences that are beautiful to me or that resonate with me in some way. And the reason I do that is I want to break down the sort of recipe of, oh, this resonated with me. Why did this resonate? And I want to be able to try to communicate that and express that in my own writing. Not by copying what they're doing, but by understanding what they're doing. And the only way to understand what good writers are writing is by reading other good writers. That's the way you're going to become a good writer. So when you are distracting yourself, please get the social media apps off your phone. Take email off your phone unless your work absolutely requires it. And even then, see if there's a way to get around it. Instead, have that Kindle app on your phone. And read whenever you're in line at Chipotle. Read when you have 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. Read whenever you have a free moment. You go to the bathroom, instead of pulling up Instagram, pull up that book you've been working on and read. And then 1 hour a day, uninterrupted, you're going to write. If you can write for longer than an hour a day, bravo. But that needs to happen in a 1 hour increment. Unlike a reading where you can just pick up this book anywhere. I got 5 minutes to go to the bathroom. Let me go ahead and flip to the page I'm on, wherever my bookmark is, and start reading. Great. With writing, there's some science that shows it takes about 22 minutes for the average person to get into a flow state. That might be different for you. It might be shorter, it might be longer, it might be different day to day. But on average, let's just assume that that is correct and it takes you 22 minutes to get into a flow state. Let's say at minute 25, you stop and check your email. Okay, you take 5 minutes of email and then you're back to writing. And then 25 minutes into that, you are now checking a tweet that someone sends you or a text message someone sends you. Well, that means you had 3 minutes of flow state at the beginning or toward the first half hour, 3 more minutes of flow state in the second half hour. You didn't write for an hour, you wrote for 6 minutes. And that's why sitting down undistracted for an hour a day is so important. Because you're going to get those first 22 minutes out of the way when you're establishing your habit. And then you have another almost 40 minutes flow state. That's when things start clicking. You still may want to put your head through a wall, but you're less likely to want to because you're focused. It's what a friend of mine called Cal, his name's Cal Newport. He wrote a book called Deep Work. It's what he talks about when he talks about deep work, is immersing ourselves in creative work. It's a good book, and I would strongly recommend you check it out. But diving deep into the work requires a distraction-free environment. Now, you may not be able to get that at home. I can't always get it at home. If Ella is here, Bex is here, it may require you renting an office somewhere. Maybe it's a co-working space. Maybe it is, there's a restaurant that has a back room. They'll let you use it for an hour a day. If you're really serious about finding a way to write, maybe it's just a relatively quiet coffee shop that you know you can avoid distractions in. That's okay. Finding a place that is going to be your optimal place for writing doesn't mean you need all the accoutrements. I don't care what kind of pen you use or what kind of notepad you're using, what kind of software program you're using. We can talk about those things if you want during the Q&A portion. What I do care about the right environment for you to remove those distractions from your life so you can sit down for an hour a day and write. Eventually that hour per day for me, which by the way, that's what I did when I first started getting serious about writing. After having that conversation with Donald Ray Pollock about removing the distractions, sitting in the chair, I said, but I don't have the time. But I was serious about being a writer, right? And so I was working 80 hours a week at the time. 80 hours a week. I just didn't have the time to write. And so what did I do? Well, I found an extra hour in the day somehow. Now for me, I don't necessarily recommend this for you. In fact, I wouldn't recommend it to my 36-year-old self now. But I was in my 20s and it worked at the time, at least for a temporary period of time. I got up at 5:45 every morning to go to work. I got up at 5:45, took a quick shower. I was out the door by 6:30 after getting dressed and having some coffee. And so instead of 5:45 every morning, I set my alarm for 4:44 every morning. This was way before the Jay-Z album, 4:44. I've written about it way before Jay-Z ever had the 4:44 album. But I think we meant two different things. But every morning, 4:44. Well, why was it 4:44? Because my only rule to write was to wake up. And I figured it would take me 1 minute to get from my bed to my writing desk, which was on the other side of the apartment, the house, rather, that I was in. And so 1 minute to get to my writing desk. So I give myself exactly 1 hour every morning. And I would stop mid-page or mid-sentence even. Because I needed to finish at 5:45 so I could get ready for work. So even mid-sentence. In fact, I learned this later on, but it's something that Hemingway did every day. I'm no way comparing myself to Ernest Hemingway. I'm just saying there's one similarity in what we did is I would leave the writing day mid-sentence. And that always gave me something to come back and be excited about, a good starting point for the next day. So it doesn't, and for me, I'm someone who's obsessed with completion. I love task lists and to-do lists. I don't even love them. I'm just OCD as hell. And so like I feel compelled, obsessed to complete things, to let my compulsion take over and finish the task in order. and of course, finish the sentence, finish the paragraph, finish the chapter today. I found that by having that limitation where I stopped at that particular point mid-sentence, it gave me something to go back to the next day. And that really helped out with my writing habit, because I go back in the next day with some fuel for the fire, and it would get that writing going much quicker. And that flow state, instead of 22 minutes, would be reduced down a bit. And maybe it would only take me 15 minutes today to get to a flow state, and then same for tomorrow. And then you get better writing out of it. Eventually, that 1 hour a day turned into 2 hours a day, and then 3 hours a day. And when at sort of my peak, I was writing. Well, there are days I've written more than 3 hours in a day, but 3 hours a day consistently was the sort of peak for me. Now it tends to be about 2 hours a day. I feel really good writing 2 hours a day, and I tend to do it 6 or 7 days a week. I do it 6 days a week, and occasionally I'll do it a seventh, but I try to take a break once a week as well. But in doing that and walking away at the 2 hour mark, I can have something to come back to the following day. Now, I also break my days up into composition and editing days, and we're going to talk about those two in the moment. Those are legs 2 and 3. So finishing up this first leg here of writing, it's establishing that writing habit. And if you walk away from this workshop today and spend the next 30 days writing 1 hour a day, then you're going to be grateful, not just to me, but you're going to be much more thankful to yourself. You were willing to sit down, remove those distractions, get the social media apps off your phone, turn all the notifications off your phone, put it on airplane mode, and turn the Wi-Fi off. Don't have the TV going. Sit down for an hour a day and write. You're going to be so happy that you did. A few other things to help you establish that writing habit before we move on to the composition process. I find that it helps to have an accountability partner if you can. Now, some of you can link up in the, if you want to link up in the comment box over here. If you're looking for an accountability partner who's taking this workshop, and you say, hey, we're just going to email each other once a day and talk about what went well, what didn't go well with our writing. Just a few quick sentences that will help keep you accountable. Or maybe it's your significant other. Maybe it's someone else in your life who's just a good friend where you're deciding to write together. Or maybe it's just someone in your life who is supportive of you. And you say, hey, can I send you an email once a day telling you what just a one sentence, what went well and what didn't go well and why? One sentence for each of those. And I found that if you do that, you're more compelled to write every day because you don't want to let your accountability partner down. Another thing that I recommend is tell the 5 people closest to you. This is especially difficult for someone like me who's an extreme introvert and shy about his creative process, but it's even more important for people like me who are not extroverted. Tell 5 people who you care about your newfound passion for writing. Man, it's going to be so easy for some of you. Some of you are going to go out there and be excited. Oh my God, look, I just took this writing workshop, and you know what I'm going to start doing? Not for the rest of my life, but just for the next 30 days, I'm going to write for 1 hour a day. And we're going to talk about what you can write in a moment, what to write when we get to the composition side of things. But just telling 5 people that you care about, that you're going to write for the next 30 days, and you have this newfound passion, and you want to drudge through the drudgery, and the way you found to do it is to sit in the chair every day for 1 hour a day for the next 30 days, the next 31 days if you're doing it in July. Telling 5 people about that will help keep you accountable, but it'll also let you know that you're not going to let them down. And when you do let them down, they will help hold you accountable. Find people who are interested in your life, and they're going to ask questions about that. I think that's important. Also, having a notebook with you at all times, I think is important. I mean, you can do it with your phone now as well. I tend to do that with the notepad on my phone. But just having like a little pocket notebook, or this one is not a pocket. This is my desk notebook here. I have a desk notebook, and for the longest time, until rather recently, within the last year or so, I stopped doing it. But we'll be doing it again shortly because I'm back in book mode. Right now I use the notepad on my phone, but jotting down ideas in a pocket notepad, especially when you're working on a longer form project, is critical. But always having something that you can write on is really important. If I do go out for a walk without my phone, I do make sure I have some sort of piece of paper or my little pocket notebook with me. I just use this moleskin one, although my friend Drew just came out with this other notebook. Let me show you because I really like it. And I'm back. All right. So, it's called the Endeavor Notebook. Mihalik, I will send you this. I'll send you a link to it. He just started a Kickstarter for it. And the thing that I like about this notebook, first of all, it's beautiful. And it's a little bit smaller than this moleskin one that I use, which I like the size of it a little bit better. But it smells like a beautiful. Like you can tell this thing is going to weather really well. But the thing I like about it is the inside is interchangeable. So once you're done with this journal or whatever you want to call it, this notebook, you just remove it. You unscrew it here, and then you do whatever you want with this. Now, some of you will object to this, but I throw away all of my notes. Well, I incinerate them, actually. That's just a practice in letting go. I'm not encouraging you to do that. If you want to hold on to every journal that you've ever written, that's all for you. Then whatever's appropriate for you is appropriate for you. Mine is an exercise in letting go. But it's a beautiful notebook. He also has a pocket version, which I'm yet to check out, and I'll replace my moleskin pocket version with that probably. I think it's just on Kickstarter right now. So here's what I'll say though. Like, this is beautiful and it's great and it'll weather nicely over time, and it's nice to have something that you feel good about aesthetically, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as go to CVS today and buy one of those Me composition books. It doesn't matter. Just have something that you can write on, and especially have something you can carry around with you and you can take notes on. You're going to get an idea in your head. You're going to get a beautiful line in your head. And unless you write it down, you want to just get that out of your head, right? That's what the composition process is all about, which we'll go into in a moment. We talked about removing distractions. We talked about reading is the best distraction. We talked about turning a noun into a verb. We talked about telling 5 friends. We talked about notebooks. Don't fetishize a notebook. A notebook's just a notebook. A pen is just a pen. I really like these Pilot G2 pens. Somewhere in there. I'm sure, Shawn, you can send them an Amazon link to that. In fact, I just buy them by the case. I buy black ones and red ones. And then big highlighters. I got a whole box of big highlighters in my desk here. And that's it. Those are the tools that I use. But more important than the tools is the habit. You don't need a whole lot of tools, right? In fact, all you really need is this computer that you're watching this on right now. You can. A lot of my novel was written on a BlackBerry because I was still in the corporate world and I had a BlackBerry. I still miss that BlackBerry. I still have dreams about it. It's the strangest thing. It's like if you had an ex-girlfriend that you really liked and you realize you're not right for each other anymore, but you still think about it. That's how the BlackBerry is. It is not appropriate for my life anymore, but sometimes I'll think about it. Strangely, I don't think about ex-girlfriends like that. But anyway, let's move on to composition. So once you are establishing the writing habit, the question is, well, what do I write, or how do I write, or what's the writing process, right? And so the second leg of the 4-legged table is composition. It's getting the words out of your head and onto the page. And that can mean just walking around and scribbling things when they come to mind. That's one way to get onto the page. But the real thing I mean is during that hour a day, or maybe 2 hours or 3 hours a day, if you decide to do that, but minimum 1 hour a day, during that time, you want to get as many words onto the page as possible. And this is going to be really difficult for a lot of you to comprehend. We're so used to self-editing as we write. I'm going to tell you, again, if you don't use this at the end of 30 days or 31 days, then go back to however you're writing right now, if that's fine. But I'm going to strongly encourage you to write without filter. Some people will call this stream of consciousness writing. And I don't call it that because, well, I think consciousness is a precursor to language, but we can get into that debate a different day. And I instead of calling it stream of consciousness, I tend to call it jam session writing. A jam session or a jam band, a garage band you might think of, or garage band is just having a jam session, is the perfect metaphor for me because there's very little expectation. There's a book called Bird by Bird where Anne Lamott talks about writing the SFD, the shitty first draft. And I encourage people to write shittily at first. I think during the composition process, the main objective is not to make beautiful writing. It is not writing with clarity and style. It is just writing. It's just getting the words onto the page. I have a blog post that went up this morning, and it's an idea I've thrown around for probably 2 or 3 years at this point. I'm just going to pull it up real quick. It's called Just for When. It's a short essay. It's, what is that, 200 words maybe? 300 words? But I can tell you it was probably 1,000 words when I first wrote it. And because I'll write different things, I'll write one paragraph 2 different ways, I will let the words pour onto the page, or in this case, the blank electronic page. And without editing those words first, I just want to get as much as I can onto the page. And the reason that the metaphor for jam session works so well is you think of a band who's just sort of playing at first. They're just hanging out in the garage trying to write new songs. And as they're trying to write those new songs, you got the drummer who maybe starts playing a beat. And from that, the bass player starts. And then from there, you have a keyboard player who starts playing a few keys. And you have the guy on the electric guitar who strums a few chords. And then that makes the drummer adjust his tempo a little bit. And from there, the keyboard player adjusts his notes a little bit. And they're just jamming. They're just playing. It's not meant to be recorded. It's not meant for an audience. It's just expressive at first. It's just tumbling. It's offbeat. It's not pristine. It's rugged. It's raw. There are warts all over it. Bits of it are ugly. It's the shitty first draft. You don't take that, what the jam band is doing, and record it and put that out as an album. Unfortunately, that is what we see right now with today's world of blogging. There are a lot of people who just go in there and jam real quick. They jam on their keyboard quite literally. Da, 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 da. Publish. Done. And that's unfortunate. Because there could be something beautiful in there. There's gold in there. We're going to talk about panning for gold as a separate metaphor when we talk about the editing process. But right now, during the jam session, it's not meant for publication. It's not meant to be seen by the masses, by 52 people or 52 million people. It's just meant to get the words onto the page, different versions or variations of words onto the page. Now, when you're writing, you may be asking yourself, what should I write about? I've got a good article for you. It's from the New York Times. And Mr. Mihalik, if you can find a link to this one, I've got it right here. Wait, where the hell did it go? What to write about? Here we go. New York Times, writing tips article. This one's just called How to Write by Colson Whitehead. I'm sure, Mihalik, you already have a link to this. It's something we touch on in the 4-week class. But they go through some rules in here, like show and tell versus, a lot of people say show, don't tell. Mihalik, we may even be able to put a link to this in the comments over there as well.
It won't let you put links in the chat, unfortunately.
Ah, that's right. I do remember that. That's why we're sending them all to you afterward. It's a New York Times article. Anyway, no links in the chat, but rule number 1 is show and tell. Most people say show, don't tell, but I stand by show and tell, because when writers put their work out into the world, they're like kids bringing their broken unicorns and chewed up teddy bears into class in the sad hope that someday someone else will love them as much as they do. And what do you have for us today, Marcy? A penetrating psychological study of a young med student who receives disturbing news from a former lover. So I think of when we're looking at what should we write about, I think, well, it depends on what you're trying to write. We just went through the 6 different types of writing a few moments ago. If you're trying to write a business email, you want to communicate. And then so your question is, what am I trying to communicate here? If you're writing fiction or poetry, then the question is, what am I trying to express? If you're writing something in the middle, if you're writing a memoir, then you're asking both. What am I trying to communicate with this writing, with this book, with this blog post, with this essay? What am I trying to communicate? Well, and what am I trying to express? You have to marry the two, right? And I think the way that we do that is by mining on either our own life experience or on made-up experience. Now, fiction is generally made up. And in fact, the reason that I wrote fiction for such a long time, and I think until very recently, I would have still called myself a fiction writer, but I don't have the privilege of saying that anymore because I haven't published any fiction in a long time, and so I can't say that I'm still a fiction writer, or even that's what I'm passionate about. I do have fantasies of getting back to that one. It's not what's appropriate for me right now. But the reason that I was so involved in is I didn't live a very remarkable life. I didn't live a life worth remarking on, especially in writing. I talked earlier about what you're doing may be interesting to you, but it's not interesting to other people usually. That was especially true for my life. I had this corporate life that was relatively banal, and there was nothing remarkable about my experience of life. So I wrote about other people's made-up lives, sort of aspirational lives and aspirational struggles and bravery and the willingness to take on difficult challenges and live an interesting life. And then something remarkable did happen. I started living a more interesting life. I started taking some pretty significant risks. I walked away from a career that was really lucrative, and I wrote about that. I wrote about my experience of letting go of 90% of my material possessions. I wrote about my experiences of, and I write about now, experiences of being a father. I have a 5-year-old now, and that is I live a more remarkable life today than I did 10 years ago. And it's a life that I found worth writing about. And in order to have a life worth writing about, we have to do things that are worth writing about. And so if you want to have something to write about, yes, I'll give you a link to this New York Times story, and there are plenty of tips on what you can write about. Like here's write what you know, Saul Bellow quote. Never use 3 words when one will do. There's all these different tips to write and how to write and what to write about. But ultimately, it's live a life worth writing about. Write about your life, and if it's not worth writing about, then make it worth writing about. I think of not to get extreme, and certainly not to encourage you to get extreme, but think of the movie and really the book, Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. The protagonist, or I guess you could call him protagonist, the unnamed protagonist in the book, has a really unremarkable life, and then his life before the book sort of starts is not worth writing a book about. But of course, the actions that happen thereafter, and starting the Fight Club and all of the chaos that ensues thereafter, is certainly worth writing about. Now, I don't encourage you to blow up any buildings or develop a schizophrenic alter ego. Spoiler alert. But I do encourage you to do something with your life that other people would find value in you expressing and communicating to them. Although, of course, you can go write a math textbook as well, and people will find value in that. That also requires sitting down for an hour a day and putting in the effort. You can't just dream about writing that calculus textbook. You have to get out there and do it. Anyway, I find that in writing, one thing that is really helpful for me is to embrace the senses. Let me talk to you about what I mean by that. We humans, we often hear about the 5 senses. We actually probably have something more like 22, or I've heard as many as 32 different senses. But let's, for the sake of the argument here, let's just assume we have the 5 senses: touch and smell and taste, and what are the other ones? Oh yeah, hearing and sight, right? Appealing to those senses is wildly important. It's what makes writing interesting. It's how you, as a reader, get engulfed in the world of a writer, is by smelling and seeing and feeling what they're communicating. So I'm going to read a page, the opening page from Jesus' Son. This is not a religious book at all, by the way. It comes from a Lou Reed line. It's about heroin. So the main character's name is Fuckhead. But I'm going to read this line. We're going to take a quick break, restroom break, before we dive into the last 2 legs, and then we'll get to a Q&A. A salesman who shared his liquor and steered while sleeping. A Cherokee filled with bourbon. A Volkswagen no more than a bubble of hashish fumes, captained by a college student. And a family from Marshalltown who headed and killed forever a man driving west out of Bethany, Missouri. Here's the part where you start to really dive into the senses of this character. I rose up sopping wet from sleeping under the pouring rain, and something less than conscious, thanks to the first 3 of the people I already named, the salesman and the Indian and the student, all of whom had given me drugs. At the head of the entrance ramp, I waited without hope of a ride. What was the point even of rolling up my sleeping bag when I was too wet to be let into anybody's car? I draped it around me like a cape. The downpour raked the asphalt and gurgled in the ruts. Let's think about this for a moment. I rose up sopping wet, this is the first sentence there, under the pouring rain, and something less than conscious. So what is that waking up feeling? Like you can feel in his head, less than conscious, like early morning, just waking up. I'm not completely conscious, but I'm not asleep either. I'm something less than conscious. Pouring rain, sopping wet, sleeping under the pouring rain. And then he goes, the head of the entrance ramp, I waited without, at the head of the entrance ramp, I waited without the hope of a ride. So you feel the rain, but you see where he's at as well. You get the lay of the landscape in one sentence. What was the point even of rolling up my sleeping bag when I was too wet to be let into anybody's car? That shows you how wet he truly was. That's the telling part. The showing was before. Now we're getting into the telling part. I draped it around me like a cape, so it's quite the visual. You can see he's got this wet sleeping bag on him like a cape. Then you hear the sound. The downpour raked the asphalt and gurgled in the ruts. Imagine this rain so heavy you can hear just the raking of the rain on the asphalt and the gurgling of the overflow in the ruts. My thoughts zoomed pitifully. Head is just zooming. His mind is wandering quickly. The traveling salesman had fed me pills that made the linings of my veins feel scraped out. So good. I mean, just one line like that is, you're hooked, right? I mean, that's the type of thing that makes me, I can't communicate that in a movie. I mean, the most popular thing I've ever done is a film. And I can't communicate. I mean, I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I thought it was great. But I can't communicate. The traveling salesman had fed me pills that made the linings of my veins feel scraped out. Anywhere else than on this page. My jaw ached. This is my favorite line in the whole book. This next line. I knew every raindrop by its name. Gives you a sense, a true sense of this main character's senses. I knew every raindrop by its name. That's the scene that's happening around him. Anyway, a great book, but it's a great book because great writing often appeals to the senses. And some people do it better than other people. I know David Foster Wallace, when you read that Ticket to the Fair essay, actually, Mihalik, I don't know if the version we're going to send them is called A Ticket to the Fair or if it's the version that's called Getting Away from Pretty Much Already Being Away from It All.
It's Ticket to the Fair. It's Harper's, has a PDF of the original pages.
Nice. Okay, so that's the attenuated version. You'll like it because it's shorter than the longer one that's in his book. I suppose it's one thing we'll never do again. But in that book, in that essay in particular, he goes through, like, you feel like you're smelling a sort of pigsty, and you can hear the sounds that are going on around him, and the whipping of batons as they go through the air as a 12-year-old baton twirling competition. I mean, he takes these banal events that David Foster Wallace does and that's ultimately what I'm encouraging you to do, is to take the banal events, getting them onto the page via the composition process, figure out what you want to write about, and then writing it down, pouring it onto the page, and then we make it interesting via the third leg, and that's the editing process. And I call that panning for gold. We're going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to take a quick bathroom break. Feel free to join me. I'll be right back. Oh yeah, Mihalik, feel free to, if you want to chime in with anything, you can do that too.
I'm going to take a quick bathroom break as well.
All right, and I'm back. So, I knew every raindrop by its name. Why is that compelling? Why is that interesting? Why is that urgent? Why do I love that line so much? Well, because there's a certain urgency. When writing is done well, we create something called narrative urgency. And the way that we create that is through the editing process. So I spend about a third of my time, 1 out of 3 days, composing. That's the second leg, the writing. So my writing habit, second leg is composition. I spend a third of my time composing. I spend 2/3 of my time editing. And that is often the most overlooked aspect of writing. We get, especially in today's world where we can publish anything immediately, we want that instant gratification. But of course, our work suffers if we're not willing to cobble it down to something more interesting, more compelling, more serving, more value adding. And so whether it's a blog post or you want to write a masterpiece of a novel, actually this is technically a short story collection, although the same characters in every story. It's a disjointed novel, really. But I spend most of my time taking what I've poured onto the page, all that sediment that has poured onto the page, the mountains of sediment, the shitty first draft with shitty first draft and more shitty drafts, all that stuff that tumbles onto the page. No self-editing during that first third. Stave off the self-editor. In fact, during that composition process, I often encourage students to turn their, take their word processor, instead of having the white page with the black ink, turn the typeface, really, turn the typeface white so you can't see it, and just keep writing so you can't see what you're writing, and therefore you won't feel compelled to go back and edit it, so that sediment pour onto the page. Because when you have enough sediment, you can write 2,000 words in a day, 3,000 words in a day. That's why I don't care about page count. Some of my best days are negative 2,000 word days. They're days that I'm editing. And so I take all that sediment and I go panning for gold. So the editing process, the metaphor I use for that, if the composition process, I was using jam session writing, just getting it out there and not worrying about other people reading it, the editing process is really about panning for gold, finding those gold nuggets inside all the sediment, and then taking those gold nuggets and melting them down, forming these beautiful gold bricks that you can then give out to the public, instead of just taking a ball of rocks and throwing it at the public. No one gets value from that. So how do we edit our writing down in a way that is meaningful for other people? The main thing I can tell you, hold on a second. I think my vacuum started going. I'll be right back. I have one of those stupid robot vacuums, and apparently around 2 o'clock on Sundays it just starts going crazy. And I thought it was someone outside with a chainsaw at first. What the hell is going on? Anyway, back to editing, creating narrative urgency. What does that mean, narrative urgency? Well, in order for our the job, well, let's put it this way. If you pick up a book, one of my favorite things to do is go to a bookstore and read the first line of books, especially novels. Because that first line in a book has one job. The first line in a book, first sentence in a book has one job. And that's to get us to read the second sentence. That's the only job. The line of the job of the second sentence is different, though. The second sentence job is to get us to want to read the third sentence. And the job of the third sentence is to get us to want to read the fourth sentence. And the job of the fourth sentence is to get us to want to read the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And ultimately, that's what narrative urgency is. The problem is, we as writers, we get really married to an idea. I write this beautiful line, and I'm not willing to let it go, even if it doesn't serve the narrative urgency of what we're trying to create. I really love this sentence I wrote. And I, for the longest time, thought, you know, everything that came off my quill was pristine, and everything that I wrote should be publishable to the world. That's wasting other people's time, though. If I write a 4,000-word essay, it better be because it justified 4,000 words. I did that recently, actually. I have a long essay. Mihalik, if you can put a link to that, it's called. It's 4,000 or 5,000 words, I think, and it's called "Can We Have an Honest Conversation About Advertisements?" But there are things I wrote, like the thing that came out today, the Just for Win thing, which is, I don't know, 200 or 300 words, and it's whatever's the appropriate amount. What's the appropriate length? I think going back to Seth Godin, he's the master of the blog post that seemingly like a short idea, like, oh, he probably wrote that in 2 minutes because it's 3 sentences long. But knowing Seth Godin, that thing that's 3 sentences long was likely 10 times as long when he started. And what's left are only the parts of the iceberg that you see. The publishable parts are the tip of the iceberg, the beauty that you will see. Everything else that's under the surface, the important things are what we don't publish quite often. And so we have to train ourselves when we're editing. We're spending 2/3 of our time editing. Now, for you, that can manifest in one of 2 ways. For me, if I'm writing for 3 hours a day, quite often I will write for an hour and edit for 2. If I am writing for an hour a day, I'll probably write one day and edit 2 following days. And sometimes I'll mix it up to do a little bit of both, where some weeks I'll just focus mostly on composition, and then next week or next 2 weeks, actually, I will focus on heavy editing, taking that sediment, finding the gold in it, and then fashioning it into something that is beautiful for the world. But one of my favorite things to do is go to bookstores. And I would encourage you to do this as an exercise. Pull out some novels and just start reading the first line and say, do I feel compelled to move on to the second line? I'll give you this. Here's the preface to this Mary Karr The Art of Memoir book. The preface is a squeaky rubber chew toy I have pawed and gnawed at for years. So even this preface, like, that's a great first line for a preface, because prefaces are usually dry, sort of boring. But of course, Mary Karr, being the consummate master of writing and a literary genius, even made the preface beautiful. First line of the actual book, so the first chapter of this one. So this isn't even a novel, but it has a beautiful first line. This is a prescriptive book, right? And at unexpected points in life, everyone gets waylaid by the colossal force of recollection. What does she mean by that? That's a beautiful line, but what does she mean? I don't know, but I want to read the second line, don't you? And do that with some books. And then what you'll find in books that are really well written, they continue to draw you forward. There's a reason we use the term page turner, because we've eliminated the fluff. We've eliminated the excess, even the beautiful lines. I forget who it was, Mihalik, was it Fitzgerald, who said, "Kill your darlings." And
that's been attributed to so many people.
Okay, yeah. So I feel like it was him first, and then maybe others have stolen it thereafter. But anyway, I think it's valuable advice. Killing your darlings, meaning, and we're in a beautiful space now where you might have this great line that just doesn't fit the blog post you're working on. It's okay, set it aside. Maybe it'll fit some other blog post some other day. But if it doesn't serve the narrative urgency of what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to express, it's got to go. It has to hit the cutting room floor. You're going to have a better product because of it. Going back to Seth Godin and talking about the relative concision of his blog posts, He publishes 1 a day. But did you know that he writes about 3 a day? That means there are 2 that you don't see. He doesn't feel compelled to publish every single thought that comes to his head. Rather, the question then ends up being, will this add value to other people's lives? And that's my ultimate hope with you and your writing, is that you find ways to create meaningful work that will add value to other people's lives. And sometimes the question to ask there, if you're really struggling with what should I write, and maybe the better question is, what problem am I trying to solve? What problem are you trying to solve? Write about that, because writing for me is often a way that helps me solidify my own thoughts about a particular topic. The advertisements essay I just talked about a moment ago, I had one thought about advertisements, and I generally think advertisements suck, and I think most of us agree with that. But I also wanted to steelman that argument a little bit, and there's a part in the essay where I talk about the upside of advertising. And I actually convinced myself that not all advertising is bad as I make it out to be, right? And then also I talk about the difference between different types of promotion. There's advertising and marketing, and there's an appreciable difference between the two, although there's a such thing as you can have good advertisements and you can have really shitty marketing. So not all marketing is created equal, just like all advertisements aren't created equal. And for me, it helps me better think about that topic. And so ultimately, writing is going to help you flesh out your thoughts on a particular topic. And who knows, you may even end up in a completely different destination than where you started. So the editing process, I would think about it as panning for gold, taking all of that sediment that you've created through your composition process and fashion it into something meaningful, cobbling it down until it is the smallest viable thing. Now, that's not always something we're able to do, because writing for the world used to mean you did one of 2 things, basically. You wrote newspaper articles or you wrote books. Now, this is an easy transition to my 4th topic here, which is publishing, or what I call neopub, the new ways of publishing. Because it used to be, to write a book, you had to write a book. And what the hell is a book? The lines are pretty blurred right now, aren't they? But they weren't always that way. A book, for the longest time, was this. Hardcover book. There's a book called Light Brothers by Mark Duplass and Jay Duplass. Have you read this yet, Mihalik? Heard of it?
No, I don't think so.
It's a sort of, I mean, there are brothers, but it's a sort of memoir of them breaking up. Although they're still brothers, obviously, but breaking up creatively. It's a fascinating book. But this used to be what a book was. It had to be these 2 covers, and a bunch of pages are glued into the middle so they don't fall out. And of course, it had to be at least 250 pages. I bet you this one is 285. Oh, 288. Yep, 288 pages. It had to be 250 pages. Why? Did it have to be 250 pages or more? Well, because publisher had to justify charging you 30 or 40 bucks for a hardcover book, because that's where they made their money. And if you didn't produce 250 pages, if what you were expressing could be communicated in 120 pages, like Jesus' son, then we can't charge you as much money. And so what were writers compelled to do by the publishers or the publishing houses? Come up with 130 pages of filler. And that's just unfortunate. The good news is a book doesn't have to be that today. In fact, a book doesn't have to be a book at all. Sometimes I get an idea for a book. There's an essay I wrote called, here's a good example. There's a book on technology that I wanted to write called Scrolling is the New Smoking. And who knows, maybe I'll end up turning it into a book someday. But it turned into a blog post, and a relatively short blog post at that, because I got it down to its densest form that I thought would add value to other people. Now, could I flesh that out into 400 pages somewhere? Yeah, maybe. And maybe there's a time where it would make sense to do that. But for me, at the time, it made the most sense to put it out there in a blog post, get this idea out there. And I probably wrote a couple thousand words on it, and the final thing might be 400, 500, 600 words, right? And attenuating it down to the thing that is, well, here's the honest truth. The thing that's going to waste the least amount of time for the audience. If you want to be respectful of your audience, the best way to do it is to write with as few words as possible. Now, concision is key. That doesn't mean it has to be one sentence. It can be 4,000 words if those 4,000 words are necessary. Otherwise, it's being disrespectful if you're just trying to pour a bunch of stuff onto the page. I've noticed in the online world all the time, there's a whole lot of throat clearing, and it drives me crazy. Most blog posts would be better if people deleted the first 2 paragraphs immediately. Go to some of the blog posts that you've seen recently, delete the first paragraph, maybe even the first 2 paragraphs, and see if it doesn't instantly get better, because it immediately puts you into the throes of what they're talking about. It gets away from the throat clearing, especially the particular nauseating throat clearing of, I'm sorry, I haven't written in a while. Who cares? Why bring that to anyone's attention? How is that important for what you're about to write? It's not, unless you're writing an essay about not having written in a while. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time. If you want to be courteous, if you really want to add value to other people's lives, if you want to help people solve problems, then solve the damn problem. Don't start with a bunch of throat clearing, and don't throw in a bunch of excess stuff that has nothing to do with the problem you're trying to solve in the first place. And then we talk about getting our writing out into the world. It can be traditionally, it can be via a book. We can take our words and write 250 pages and submit a proposal to an agent, and they can find us a publisher and we can get it published, maybe. Maybe. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. That used to be the path. It's no longer the path. It is a path now. It's not a path that I've taken personally, or at least not directly. But it is a path that people can take. I am a fan, however, of the more dispersed publishing models. I tell you, if there's one thing that I am glad that I did more than anything else is start a blog. December 14th, 2010, Ryan and I started theminimalists.com, and it's the best creative decision I've ever done. It's led to everything else that has happened, including this writing workshop, including to the 4 books that I've published, including the podcast that we started, the documentary we put out, the new documentary we have coming out, TED Talks and book tours and speaking engagements. It all started because I started writing some words on a blog. And I was a fiction writer at the time. I had only written fiction up until that point, besides business emails. And the only thing I'd done that was I felt like creative outside of work was writing fiction. And it didn't translate exactly over into the blogging realm, but it was, there were enough ingredients that translated. In fact, if you go back and read a lot of the early stuff, it just reads a little bit like some of the fictive stuff that I had been writing at the time. And you'll also notice even back then I had a problem with attenuation. You know, I was not willing to kill all of my darlings at first. In fact, I think it was 5 years into it, back in 2015, Ryan and I, as well as Sean Harding, our editor at the website, he and we went back and edited literally every essay and brought some of those 4,000 word essays down to a palatable 800 words and so forth and so on. Again, not making it perfect, but putting our best foot forward, making it ideal, right? And so starting a blog, I find to be really important. Now, you can do that publicly. You can blog publicly. In fact, I've got a whole guide on how to start a successful blog. If you're interested, it's just theminimalists.com/blog. So many people ask me how we started our blog and how we got the design to look the way we wanted to look. And so instead of responding back via email, back in 2011, I wrote a step-by-step recipe of how to start a blog. And then I updated a few times since then, most recently updated it earlier this year. So updated it for 2018 because a lot of people have found value in that. Thousands of people have started a blog based on that blog post. And it is a bit longer because it is a step-by-step instruction guide of how, it's an instruction manual basically of exactly how I started a blog. And from there, that led to publishing books. Now, what does a book mean? Like, that was the thing I always wanted to do. In fact, I was hesitant to start a blog early on because I wanted to write books. I enjoy reading books. I want to write books. And I've become more vehicle agnostic would be the phrase I would use. Because I realized that sometimes a book is not the best way to convey an idea. Sometimes it is the best way to convey an idea, or a set of ideas, or an ideology. But sometimes the best way to convey an idea is via a tweet. Sometimes it's a blog post. Sometimes it's a podcast. Sometimes it's a movie. Sometimes it's a song. Now, I wanted to write books. I wanted to be an author. What does that even mean anymore, writing books? Ryan and I have written 3 books together. I make a living from writing books, so I guess you could say I'm an author now. But we, most months, sell more audiobooks than physical books. And some months we sell more ebooks than print books. Is an audiobook a book because it doesn't have 250 pages glued between a hardcover? Yeah, I think so. I have a friend named Rob Bell who wrote-ish. He released an audiobook called Launching Rockets. It's 17 observations on parenting. But there is not a physical book for it. There's not an ebook either. There is not a written document. It's an auditory book. Is that a book? I don't know. We can use this term loosely now. Quite often on our podcast, I give out books to people who call in with a question. If they say, "Hey, I've got a question about stuff," and we wrote this book called Essential. There's a whole chapter about stuff in there. I'd love to send you a copy of Essential. I'll send you the audiobook or the ebook or the book. And it's funny we have to delineate now, right? Because it's no longer required to have it be 250 pages. In fact, I have another friend, his name is Julian Smith. He wrote a book called The Flinch. It's one of my favorite books. And Seth Godin had a publishing imprint called Domino. And they published 1 book a month for a year. And the last book of that run was Julian Smith's book, The Flinch. Great book. Now, when Julian Smith turned it in, what he told me was he turned it in and it was about 120 pages when he gave it to Seth Godin, and he was worried about the length of it, right? Because, of course, books need to be 250 pages. And he turned it in and he said, "Hey, look, I know the length, a little worried about it, but I think I really convey what I want to convey here." And after reading it, Seth brought it back to him and said, "You're right, the length is off." He's like, "Yeah, I know. It's one thing I was worried about." He goes, "How much longer should it be?" And Seth looked at him puzzled. He was like, "What do you mean longer? I think this book could be communicated in 30 pages, 35 pages. I want you to go back and rewrite the principles in this book 1 tweet at a time. Until you have," and talk about narrative urgency, right? Going back and writing, because of that, if you go read the book, The Flinch, most of the lines in that thing are literally tweetable. And he got it down to this much more dense thing. And they released it as an ebook only, and hundreds of thousands of copies of that thing have been sold now. I think you can get it for $2.99 these days. But it's well worth the $2.99 because here's the thing, I pay even more for that. What's the old Mark Twain quote? I'm sorry about the length of this letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter. Doesn't that perfectly illustrate the editing process? I didn't have time to make it shorter. That's what we want to do. We want to deliver what we're trying to deliver to the world in the best vehicle possible. Sometimes that can be an ebook. Sometimes that can be a blog post. Sometimes it can be an audiobook without a book at all. If you're interested in writing your own book, I have a resource for you. I can't spend a lot of time on it right now because, well, I want to be respectful of your time. And it looks like I'm already over, and we haven't even got to the Q&A portion of this yet. But Colin Wright and I, a good friend of mine named Colin Wright, we started a publishing company back in 2012. And we established our own method of publishing our own books. We wanted to bridge the gap because there used to be just this, there are two types of publishing: traditional publishing, where you go to one of the big 6 publishers and they give you 15% of the money if you're lucky, and they put your book in bookstores that don't really exist anymore, sadly. And then there was vanity publishing, like you go and print your own books up basically, and you have these self-published sort of monstrosities that were not well put together. The way I look at it, you had like major pop bands like Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran. There's certainly talent there. Major, that's like the major label that's sending as traditional publishing. And then you had garage bands that you didn't really want to hear. Who wants to go hear a garage band right now? Very few people. But there was this whole middle ground that was missing in publishing. It was what I call indie publishing. And that's what the minimalists have done. That's what Colin Wright did. And we started this publishing company called Asymmetrical Press. And we wrote a 6-part blog post series called How to Publish an Independent Book. And then Shawn Mihalik turned that into an actual book, a book. And we can send you a link to that as well. If you want the book, it's really cheap. Or you can get the whole thing for free. Just go into the Asymmetrical website. We'll send you a link to that in the follow-up email as well. And I found that process was as rigorous as the traditional process, but it gave you all the freedom of a garage band. And I make a living now off of being an independently published author. You know, we don't do advertisements on our website. We have a wildly popular podcast. We don't do advertisements on that either. It almost pays for itself now because we have Patreon supporters. Some of you are probably Patreon supporters, and that allows us to pay for we have built a studio, and we have a full-time producer. So it almost pays for itself. I still have to pay a little money out of pocket from book royalties to do that. But I make a living as an author, and I feel really grateful to be able to do that. But it doesn't mean I'm necessarily opposed to going the traditional route. In fact, I finished a proposal yesterday to potentially do that with what the next book would be. And there are upsides and downsides for going that route. And it would have to, in fact, we got a few offers on our last book, Everything That Remains, but it didn't make sense. I like being in control of my own destiny. And blogging, podcasting, independent publishing has allowed me to be in control of my own destiny. It also means I have to get really good at the publishing process, the marketing of my own work, getting my work out into the world, but it also means I get control of that, and no one else gets to shape my vision for me. And I know that my success is because I earned it. And so I'm not against going the traditional route. There's a lot to be said about that. Although what the traditional route does really well is distribution. Distribution is becoming less and less necessary these days. There are 1,243 Barnes & Nobles still open. And that number continues to shrink. And by the way, they don't make money from books. They make money from everything besides books. The cafes and the calendars and the notebooks and the pins and the tchotchkes and little stuffed animals and puzzles and stuff like that. And I enjoy, there's a great bookshop 2 or 3 blocks from me here in Los Angeles. I love going there. I'll go there once a week, and Bex and I will go, and we'll read first sentences out of books together. And I try to buy books from independent bookshops like that. In 2014, we did an independent bookstore tour. We did 100 cities, 119 events. In almost every city, we had an event at an independent bookstore. And that was important because those shops serve the community. And traditional publishing does a really good job of getting your book into bookstores like that. But fewer and fewer people are buying books from those places. They're buying books from Audible. They're buying ebooks from, or for whatever, Kindle or Kobo or Nook. And fewer and fewer people are buying hardback books. And so even if you do get a great publishing deal, you're not guaranteed to make a living off of that. And so I think it's better to take control of your own destiny. Start a blog, build an audience by adding value to their lives. Not a massive audience, but the smallest viable audience. Find other blogs that you admire. People like Seth Godin, people like Cal Newport, and see what they have to say, and why is their writing meaningful, and why is what you're writing meaningful? What problems are you solving? Before I open up to Q&A, actually, if you all have questions, you can start typing them in the comments. Shawn, if you want to curate those, I'll let you ask me those questions. We'll go through those for at least another 15, 20 minutes, longer if we must. Again, want to be respectful of your time. I can do this all day. I'm just talking to a camera. This is relatively easy. I told you this is a standalone class. I hope you found immense value from it. I hope you continue to find value from it. You can go back and watch it, and also find value from the resources that we email out to you after the fact, and you can go back and watch the video whenever you want. We'll leave this up in perpetuity unless YouTube goes out of business or something, then it will be gone. But it'll be up there. You can go back as a resource. If you're interested in my 4-week writing class, then first let me just give you a marketing pitch to try to talk you out of it, because it's not for everyone. It does require at least 7 hours a week of work. So if you can't dedicate 7 hours a week, I think you'll get more value from it if you can do 9 or 10 hours a week of work in that class. It's a 4-week class, but it can also be stretched out if you need to stretch it out a little bit longer. I've had some people stretch it out up to 16 weeks because it's sort of take it at your own pace. So it's 4 weeks. There's 21 classes. There's 21 videos that I send out via email, and then there's a bunch of other stuff there as well. There's 26 email updates. There's 59 pages of written content. There's 7 course documents that you get sent throughout the class. There are 5 different books that are required, and we go through the books, including one of them is Writing with Clarity and Style. There's 2 adjunct professors. Mainly it's just Mr. Mihalik. We also have Chase Knight, who's another talented novelist who helps out with some stuff as well. There's a final homework assignment that we grade, and it gets critiqued line by line. There are a bunch of relevant links and articles and other books that I share. There's a private Facebook group where you can connect with other people who are taking the class. There's scores of other tools and resources that are out there for you to use that I want to provide you with value. It's a 4-week class, and you can keep diving back into those videos as much as you want, rewatching them. Once you have them, they'll be yours, and you can keep going back and playing with the material and using it to make your writing life better. But I also understand that it's not a cheap class. It's $600. But what I'll do, Shawn, if you could give them a link in that email you send out. If people want to apply the $50 they paid for this toward that writing class, I think we can put that discount on there. That way it'll be like you took this writing workshop for free. Again, please don't feel compelled to take it. It's only if you really want to dive deeper, then you're welcome to do it. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed like you have to do it. You have a lot of resources right now you can take into your writing life and start writing immediately. If you want to dive deep on the 4 things we talked about today, especially the publishing side of things, we go pretty deep on that, then you can do that. I also teach a stories class that is a sort of we append the general writing class. There's an additional 4-week how to write better stories if you want to focus on fiction or narrative nonfiction. And I think you can take the 2 classes together. It's only an extra $100 to get the 2 together. If you take them separately, they're $600 each. But both of those are options. We'll send you a link to that in the email, and so you don't feel rushed. Shawn, if you could make that discount last for the next week, next 7 days, I would appreciate that, a $50 discount. And then if you enjoyed this workshop and you want to write a testimonial, if you thought it was awesome, then you can send a testimonial to awesome@howtowritebetter.org. That's the email address, awesome@howtowritebetter.org. All right, if you all have some questions, then I have some answers. I can't promise they're the right answers, but I definitely have some answers. I'd love to dive deep into your questions. What do we got, Mr. Mihalik?
Let's start with, I'm terrified of writing. How do I overcome this fear?
Terrified of writing. Well, I'm thinking. So I took Ella. Ella just turned 5 recently, and man, there's this picture. I gotta find this picture so you can see it, and this will perfectly illustrate the terror. So it was Ella's 5th birthday. We took her down to Disneyland down in Orange County. And there were parts of it she loved. This is us on Splash Mountain. You can see that there. You can see my face. There's some slight terror there, but then let's zoom in a little bit closer to Ella. Look at that. Now this, because I know Ella so well, let me talk to you about what this expression is. This expression is absolute joy and absolute terror. It is the edge of both. Had Splash Mountain been any more terrifying, she would have had a terrible experience. But it was so far outside of her regular comfort zone, just far enough out on the edge of terror, that it was extremely joyous. And so what you need to do is figure out what that edge of terror is for you. What are you terrified about? Are you afraid that other people are going to judge you? Because they will. So the only time you're not going to judge is if you don't do anything worthwhile. The only time you're going to not get criticized is if you don't do the work. You're going to get criticized, and that's okay. I've written quite a bit about criticism. Most recently, there's an essay called Unsolicited Discharge. You can find that on our website. And there are links to 5 other things I've written about criticism. So if you're afraid of the criticism, that's a great place to start. Read about that. It'll help you rationalize your fear and also realize how irrational that fear is. Ask yourself what you're terrified about, and then how do you get outside of your comfort zone? Not so far that you're going to be truly terrified. I don't want, because we took her on another ride and she was crying afterwards. She was scared. I forget which one it was, but there was some terror there for sure. And that one was too far outside of her comfort zone. But you want to get to the edge. You want to be uncomfortable, because that place of discomfort, that discomfort zone, is the place from which you grow the most. What's the next question?
I'm just curious, was the too scary ride the Hall of Presidents? Because those wax mannequins are...
No, it wasn't.
Just crazy. Do you have any advice for non-native English speakers who are looking to write in English?
Yes, read a lot more English. I've had quite a few people who have taken the 4-week class who are non-native English speakers. Ideally, I mean, you're writing this in English, so you have a grasp. It sounds to me like it's a second language for you, or maybe a 3rd language. And I will just say I commend you on what you're doing, because if you, I've struggled writing in English for the longest time. I've gotten pretty decent at it now. I'm not David Foster Wallace or Jonathan Friends or Mary Carr, but I've gotten good enough that I feel good about publishing my writing, but it has to do with reading more in English. Now, here's the other thing: write more in your own native language as well. I mean, you don't just because the class is called How to Write Better. It's not how to write better in English. If you're writing more, I just want you to write more, because I want you to communicate and express more, right? And so it takes in order to get comfortable with writing in English, first you need to get comfortable with writing. And in order to get comfortable with writing, you're just going to have to write. I don't care what language it's in. It's whatever language you're most comfortable with, because you're already uncomfortable with writing, and establishing that daily habit just means putting the words on the page. I don't care if they're in English or if they're in Spanish or whatever your language is. So be it. Get the words on the page and read more English. And one other thing, read books that challenge you. And this is just good advice for anyone. This isn't just for non-English speakers, but when you're reading, the thing about David Foster Wallace I talked about earlier, that book Infinite Jest, it requires a lot of work, and there are a lot of words in there where I'm like, man, like it's gorgeous, but I don't even know what the hell that word means. Like it helps you expand your own vocabulary. And expanding your own vocabulary is important for anyone who wants to be a writer. Not because you want to use big puff words. You never want to use the $100 word when the dime word will suffice, but good vocabulary adds precision to your language. You wouldn't say a woman is very pretty. You would say she's beautiful. All right, next question.
How should you divide your time among the 4 legs of writing? And where does research fall into that?
Yeah, research is not writing, okay? Research can be important, just like reading is important. So the habit, when we talk about the 4 legs, all the time is spent, by the way, publishing isn't writing either. It's part of the writing process, right? So all the time is spent on 2 and 3, composition and editing. 1/3 of your time is spent composition, 2/3 of your time editing. Trust me, for the next 31 days, if you just let the words pour on the page, turn the ink white, or another thing you can do is just take a piece of paper and tape it over your monitor so you can't see what's on the screen. If you do that, then all of a sudden you're not worried about what, you're just getting the words out. And that's the important part. You do that for 1/3 of the time, you edit 2/3 of the time. Everything else outside of that is extracurricular, including publishing and including research, including reading. It's all about composition and editing. Next question.
How much editing do you think a project should go through before it's good to publish? Someone else asked this in a good way that I liked. How do you know when you're ready to show a project to other people?
Oh, okay. It depends on what the project is, right? So something shorter, like a blog post. I always have at least 2 people look at it before I publish something, and sometimes more. But so a show to other people might just mean people that you trust for trusted feedback, right? There's a difference between feedback and criticism. Feedback presents solutions. Criticism points out the problem. I'm not looking for criticism. Criticism doesn't help me at all. What helps me is getting feedback from people I trust. And so Shawn Mihalik reads and edits every single blog post I put out there. And even now, I mean, you should see the 400 word or 300 word thing that went up on the blog post today. I think there were 12 suggestions on it. 12 for something that short. And so it's the old like clean pair of eyes analogy, right? Getting a clean pair of eyes. So there are points where you say, okay, I'm ready to let go of this, even though I know it's not perfect. Okay, there's an intellectual way, and then there's like sort of the emotional way that you know. When you know, you know. I mean, sometimes you'll just know and you'll feel it. Okay, that's the emotional side. I know this is ready. It's not perfect, but this is the absolute best I could do given the resources I have. That's the rational side, where it's like, okay, am I answering the question I'm trying to answer here? Because ultimately, that's what writing's doing. It's answering the question. What question am I answering? And did I adequately answer it with this? If so, then you know it's ready. But it's not ever going to be perfect. And if your affinity for perfection is so high that you're still tweaking that thing day after day after day, eventually it's going to make it worse. And so there is going to be a point where you just have to let it go, or at least set it aside and maybe come back to it eventually. There's probably 200 blog posts I've started, and there are various stages of completion that just died on the vine. Some of them I go back to. The Just for Win thing is a good example of that. It's something I started probably 3 years ago. And I've talked about it out loud quite a bit at different events or on podcasts and stuff, but never wrote it down. And eventually just came back to it and had some different bits and pieces, cobbled them together, edited until it got down to this pretty dense thing, and then published. In fact, I noticed one thing that this morning I changed this morning even. So there was one word I changed. And so even then, once it's done, you can always go back and fix something later if you have to. It's not going to be perfect.
A good follow-up to that. How do you know when you have enough material to start editing?
To start writing?
Start editing.
Oh, start editing.
You've written enough that it's time to edit.
Yeah. That's a good question. And quite often, you'll know the same way you'll know that the piece is done. Have I built enough sediment here that I have, is there enough material here to ultimately answer the question that I'm trying to answer? Is there enough material here to ultimately provide a solution? And if the answer is yes, or at least 80% yes, then you're ready to start editing. Because the reason I say 80% yes is inevitably through that editing process, you'll have new bits of composition where you need to tack something onto a paragraph, where you need to clarify a point by adding a little bit more. But ultimately, you need to know whether you're solving the problem you set out to solve, and is there enough material here to do that? Let's do two more. We're already almost 40 minutes over.
All right. How do you find and then grow your audience, or how did you find your niche when you started?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal should not be to grow an audience. I think that's the wrong goal, because do you know how you can grow an audience? You could go rob a bank today and put it up on Instagram stories. You get a lot of followers that way, right? As you're being chased around the country by cops. That grows an audience. That doesn't add any value to anyone's life. That's like the other analogy I think of is a car crash, right? I can't help it, but when I'm driving past a car crash, I've waited in line, driving down the 405, and I'm looking, and I see all these people rubbernecking, and then of course I get to the car crash. What the fuck do? I do the same thing. Look over. I see the car crash, but then I keep driving. You can crash. You can do something that is so masturbatory that it gets a bunch of viral clicks. But if you're not adding any value, no one's going to end up staying. So what's really the point anyway? The way that I built an audience was through adding value to other people's lives. And that's it. If I can give you 2 words, it's simple. Add value. Those 52 readers, literally those 52 readers the first month, they turned into 500. And that's because a few people shared it. A few of those people shared it. 500 turned into 5,000. Now we have over 4 million people a year on the website, about 20 million people a year across all the platforms that we have, including Netflix. And that's all because we found a way to add value to other people's lives. And then you find the best vehicle to communicate the message that you want to communicate, right? And so sometimes the best vehicle is a documentary. Sometimes I've been doing this YouTube series recently called Living Room Conversations, where I just sit here in my living room and answer 1 question a day, every day in June. That's a vehicle for quick, bite-sized questions, right? That's the best vehicle for that. The best vehicle for a 1-word or 1-sentence sort of maxim is Twitter. So I'll use Twitter for that, right? And so finding the right vehicle has been important. And so find the right vehicle and then try to add value to people's lives via the appropriate vehicle. And if it ever feels inappropriate, if it ever feels spammy, if it ever feels gross, it probably is. Pop-ups are a thing I think about all the time. Websites with pop-ups drive me insane because it's not the best way to do it. 1 more.
All right. How do you find your own unique voice? And this applies not just to narrative writing, but we've also been getting this question from people who want to do the same in academic style writing.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating is the way it's almost this weird paradox, and it seems like it doesn't make sense. The way you find your voice is by mimicking other people's voices. That's really weird, right? Because it's like becoming maybe think about being an actor, right? And if someone is an actor, they pick up they could do their Robert De Niro impression, and they could do, or maybe think of a comic who actually does impressions on stage, right? There's this comedian, his name's Godfrey, not Gilbert Godfrey, but just Godfrey, one name. Anyway, he does these impressions on stage, and they're really good. He can do, Jay-Z, and then he can do Donald Trump in the span of 2 minutes. And it's fascinating to see him do that. But by mimicking these different people, he in a way has created his own voice. Now, if he just only did a Jay-Z impression all the time, he was all Jay-Z 100% of the time, then you'd be like, oh, that's not fascinating to me. But what we do is, in fact, this book, Jesus' Son, I remember in my 20s, and I've actually heard that other people have done this. So this was an original idea, but this is just proving my point. I thought it was an original idea, but other people have had the same original idea, which makes it unoriginal. There are chapters from this I would just type out on my computer. So I wanted to see how he was writing these sentences like this. Like, how do you, like, what does that sentence feel like? How's it structured? Find your favorite authors. See what resonates with you about them. The pace, the flow. These are all things we didn't have time to talk about today that I go deep on in the 4-week class. But figuring out what the pace of something is. Are your sentences really concise? If so, why? Are they really long and airy and auditory? If so, why? What does that convey? What does that pace? What does that structure convey? And over time, you're not really mimicking these other authors by having a bunch of different authors. What you're doing is you're taking a recipe from this guy, from this gal, from this gal, and this guy. And you're creating your own recipe for writing. And in doing so, you'll refine your voice over time, and they'll all start to blend in, because you're not going to know that the cilantro came from this recipe, and the paprika came from this recipe, and the tuna fish came from this recipe. They all sort of start blending in together to become your own recipe and your own flavor. It takes a while for that to happen, but until then, it's okay to use other people's recipes, not to steal from them, not to plagiarize, don't get me wrong, but to find a way to convey what they've conveyed to you, and sort of be a sounding board, start using their talents to convey what you're trying to convey. All right, y'all, that's all I got for today. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm sorry we went 45 minutes over, but hopefully you got value out of those 45 minutes. I really am honored you decided to spend the day with me and with Shawn. Check out Shawn's books as well. We'll send some links to what's your favorite novel that you've written, Shawn? I can tell you my favorite of yours.
Oh, depends. So if the assured expectations of,
that's my favorite for sure.
But I think, as is inevitable, my latest, The Dissection of Vertebrates, is my favorite, because I think our most recent tends to be our favorite.
Yeah, I think so. Otherwise,
yeah,
we don't finish the book.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've had that problem 4 times in the last 5 years, so that resonates with me. Yeah, Assured Expectations is it's a really short novella. You wrote it by hand, which I thought was really fascinating. Yeah. So if you want to see some really good short writing, an example of almost, it's not flash fiction, it's not short stories, it's a novella, but it's a really good book, man. And I'm proud of you. I've seen Shawn grow as a writer from when you were, what, 19 when we first met, 20, something like that.
Yeah, right around there.
And he's approaching 30 relatively soon. So yeah, it's been a while, but I've seen you grow as a writer, and now you're an editor as well. So that's a beautiful thing to see.
I have an article about celebrating my 28th birthday on shelves right now in the current issue of Paleo Magazine.
Or some beautiful photos as well.
Yes, which I took most of those.
Nice. Well, thank you all for being here. We'll send you all the resources within the next 24 hours. You can come back to this video within 24 hours or after 24 hours as well. I think it takes a little while for it to post. But you can come back to this as well and look at whatever you want to look at. Hope to see you in the 4-week class if that's something you're interested in, also something you're willing to commit to that amount of time. It's ongoing, but we'll give you that discount for the next week. And I'm just grateful you decided to spend this time with me. Thank you so much. I get a lot of value from this. I hope you get value from it as well. We'll see you next time.